All right. Shalom, shalom, family. Just going to say the Lord's Prayer. Father in heaven, honor be thy name, and thy kingdom come, and thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us each day our daily bread, and forgive us of our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us on a righteous path, and guard us from the evil one. In your name we pray. Amen. Amen, amen. All right, so we have been doing a lot of major studies on the biblical time frame. We have done a lot of major studies on the pinpoint people of who are the individuals of the Bible. Now I think it's time that we take the time, after all the different connections that we had done, to start putting some pieces together and looking at these things at a major view. When I say a major view, I'm saying basically taking the sum of all the different diverse genetic studies and tools that we have at our disposal to make sure we got a good understanding of what's going on in the creation. So first, let me show my screen. First, I'm going to make this logical and this clear understanding that this should be something that makes common sense, right? If we're concluding that there are genetic jewelry, right, Jews around the world, then we're concluding that there must have been a genetic Shem, Ham, and Japheth and everything. So that's why we took the time to look at some of the more pinpoint recently studies that we were doing, the academic studies that we were just recently looking at from the beginning of creation into the midpoints, into the Tower of Babel, and the evidence of the Ham, Shem, and Japheth sons, who could be the Israelites, who could be the Canaanites. What about some of the interesting names that come around that land, the Hebrew or the Hyksos? And then what we just did yesterday. We talk about some of the history of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and his whole family, right? The Moabites, the Ammonites, the Midianites, and the land, right? The exact land. So that was something that we thought was very interesting and important to do. It goes together with what we already been studying on, is a lot of different genetic studies and papers for different haplogroups and stuff, right? Let me make sure I go to this right here. All right, so now this first video right here on our Synthetic Sunday playlist, what we're going to do today reflects basically the summary that this actually had put, basically giving us a good understanding. But mostly today, what I'm going to do is more point out what was more around that land and why is it important to kind of get a good understanding of those things. So yesterday, we had looked at this note. We was talking about the lands of Abraham and everything. And we know that at that time, there's no doubt that there was a mixed culture of Amoritic groups that would have popped up around that area, that would have went down into the Middle Kingdom, Egypt and everything. So that was very important for us to kind of note and everything. But I want to talk about roots today. I want to talk about origins and roots. And the reason why is because not a lot of people think about this when you think about the biblical narrative. Let me just point out something when I'm talking about the biblical narrative, right? In the time of the biblical narrative, you got to understand that the land and the languages would have been highly Semitic, and they would have been in this Middle Eastern area, right on this corner here of the edges of the Mesopotamian and Mediterranean areas. So they would have been right here where a lot of those events would have happened. Now, the reason why I say that's important is because there's an important saying that's said, and I actually made sure I posted on the video we did yesterday in the comments. Well, in the comments. In the description, I posted something that, let me make sure I point out. Indeed, that. All right. Let me make sure I point this out on here. Right. So a lot of things when we think about like scripture, it gives us these very important scriptures that we need to always remember when we're looking at things. Right. For example, right here, Deuteronomy 26:5. It said, and you shall speak and say before the Lord your God. And then notice what it says right here is basically it will say like a Syrian or Aramean, right? That's actually important. Not a Amorite, but basically Aramean or Amorite, right? And what that basically is basically like Aramean is basically the Syrians or that Aramaic that later rises up, that comes from basically the lands of Aram. And that's actually important because the Most High says to say, oh, you're basically coming from the lands of Syria, you went into the areas of Africa. Well, what's interesting about that is that when we hear concepts like that, oh, the Israelites had to come from areas of, the upper Eurasian areas. A lot of times when people look at like African groups, they'll say, oh, there's no way they can be Israelites. But that's what we had looked at yesterday and a couple of days before when we was looking at that. They kept saying there were Nubian groups in those groups. So today I'm going to take a little bit of time of going over some of the origins of some of the groups that may be accidentally proclaimed as being African groups. And only when I say African groups, I'm not saying that they aren't African. I'm saying that they're not only African. That means they have other places that they can be found. For example, one of the headquarters of many different diverse groups start to expand during the Neolithic time frame. And now we talk about a bottleneck that happens in this time frame, and then a lot of different diverse lineages that will come out around the area of the Fertile Crescent, right? Different farmers and everything moving around, and then we settle in different areas. I just want to read you something that I think was kind of interesting from this little study from 2022. It says ancient DNA research in the past decades have revealed the European population structure changed dramatically in the prehistoric period. So that's like the Natufian time frame, 14,000 to 3,000 years before present, right? So Neolithic to Bronze Age, reflecting the widespread introduction of Neolithic farmers and Bronze Age steppe ancestry. However, little is known about the population structure change in the historical period onward, so 3,000 to present. To address this, we collect whole genomes from 204 individuals from Europe and Mediterranean, many of which are the first historical period genomes from their region, right? So Armenia, France. We find that most regions show remarkable inter-individual basically connections pretty much. And what's interesting was why I'm showing you this is what we start to notice and what you're going to see here is that a lot of lineages after Ham, Shem, and Japheth's divisions, they started to basically dwell in these upper areas like Armenia. You can even get North Africa has genetic connections to other places like the Levant and some places of the Caucasus Mountain and other places. They start to find out that a lot of places were highly intertwined. They start to find like a lot of these places were highly related. And that makes a lot of sense when you start to kind of consider the biblical narrative with these things. Let's kind of go about that and take a look at it, because we're going to look at basically how humans were in the lands of the Levant and how it shapes our understanding of why we should look at the Levant in a more diverse view. So this work highlights basically the utility of ancient DNA in revealing complex population dynamics through direct genetic observations, through time, and importance of basically different historical understandings and these complexities, right? So that's just getting a little bit of understanding of some of those things. Let me just show what this is, the reason why I'm showing this, because we're going to look at some deep roots for like mtDNA. The reason why is because I hear a lot of people talk about certain mtDNAs. Like I think L3 has a lot of importance in knowing for human origins. This was made 2022, and it just talk about stable population structured in Europe since the Iron Age, despite high mobility. So it just lets us know of a lot of different groups they found to be highly connected, and that's kind of important to note for some things. Why is that important to note? Let's just kind of go about it and see. So this is going to be important. This little thing is going to be from a paper. A lot of people know about this paper, but it is of the continuity and admixtures in the last 5 millennia in the Levantin. This is actually is important. This is that one on the Canaanites history. So the Levantin history from ancient Canaanite and present day Lebanese genome sequences. So this one was the one that came in 2017. But not a lot of people know how important this little paper actually is, especially when it comes to the Levant and everything, and some of the stuff it tells us on this. And I think one of the interesting things that it tells us is the mixtures in the areas of the Levant Neolithic. Now, no doubt that they have a high portion of Natufian, so they would have Natufian in it, but they have a kind of a spread from a bunch of different places. So a kind of a spread in the Levant starts to arrive in like different areas from a bunch of different places. And I think it's kind of important to note how mixed some of these areas are going to be in the Levant. So I'm going to just kind of give these highlights into, so I can point out what's going to come when I'm going to point out the pinpoints of the haplogroups. The genetic history of continuity and mobility in the Iron Age Central Mediterranean. So getting a little understanding of basically areas like, because, you know, if you think about it, you would expect if someone was to settle on the Levant, right? The Levant, right? The Levant shouldn't be too hard for someone to settle. Anybody around these areas could settle in the Levant because it's like the middle of all the cross points. But there's a difference between someone over here settling in the Levant and someone in Arabia settling in the Levant. Why is that important? Because if you know in history, which we go over a few different times, and also from the facts of the genetic history, we actually know that on the areas of Africa, there was an early group of Shemites that went down there very early in the Bronze Age, and they were called Jottonites. This is actually very important because you'll see different records of Abyssinia being Semitic. When it talks about the Semite groups, will also be in connections to Abyssinia, right? When we think of different areas, connection to Abyssinia and Sabaeans. That's important because when you're connecting the Arabs, you got to note that they are actually going to be entwined with groups of early Jottonites, right? We had talked about this before when we had pointed out that they were speaking that early Jottonite tribes, right? They are divisions of Eber. These are going to be genetic ties to find individuals of Abraham. So that's important to know that right after the Neolithic, we should know that Abraham's family should be in Arabia and corners where Abyssinia is, because that's actually what it talks about. What it talks about, the Jottonites became the Sabaeans. That's what that was talking about. The Semitic groups are Sabaeans as well. And then it also let us know that they went into the areas of Punt. They actually let us know they went to areas of Punt. This is a historical document. We're going to talk about some historical documents and some genetic information as we go. So this is actually going to be something that I think is kind of important. We usually point this out, but the reason why is because not a lot of people know that this history is so real that they did do a lot of genetic tests on these groups, and they found that history to be basically aligned with these groups. So that's gonna be actually important to kind of note when we think about the historicity of early individuals of Abraham who will be related to Abraham, right? We think about Eber and Jotun and Peleg. These are going to be relatives to Abraham. So it's going to be kind of important to note as we go over these things, right? And make sure I pull up a note here. I'll show that from a certain note. Bro, I'll put that all weird. There we go. Let me open up a note on there. Let that open up. But this is why I was showing that, because you see this little area here. So you can see this area of Africa and this area. They say that basically they was moving through this Mesopotamian area for a long time. So, I mean, Mediterranean. They was moving through the Mediterranean area for a long time and going to the Mesopotamian area. So this is very important. Very, very important. That is going to have some genetic ties with these different areas, right? Why is that important? Because when you think of, you know, how the world looked back in, it wasn't so black and white. In fact, it wasn't black and white. It was more diverse and culture-like, and clans and tribes and different things like that. That's important to note. It just goes on in the early Iron Age, Phoenician and Greek city-states established trading ports and colonies across the Mediterranean. One such colony, Carthage. So Carthage is in Africa, right in this corner right here. So the Phoenicians were connecting all these little areas. Originally founded by Tyre, right? became the capital of basically the Phoenician Pontic territory, right? So that's very important because that group went at it with the Romans and everything. So it just lets us know a little bit about that area after the Iron Age became a territory of the Phoenicians. This little area over here. Now, why is that also important? Because, it's interesting to note that groups were kind of merging together and moving together, and kind of note what we see over there. Now, I want to show you this because I think this is kind of important. Let me make sure I showed this. So this is just a recent study here. And this one as well. Let me make sure I point this out because I want you to note something. There's actually an L group that's up there fairly early. And it's so early that you'll be surprised. You'll be surprised about some things about it, which we're going to point out. So this is just the paper. I already got a highlight from this that I'm going to point out on this thing. And we'll close that because we don't need that. All right. So you can see right here when they talk about, now remember, these are the groups I was talking about over here that had connections of moving throughout all these different areas. And they said that the genetics there, we can find some interesting ntDNA groups. So here's going to be basically mitochondrial haplogroups for each region in the Iron Age, right? Central Mediterranean and everything. So we can see a lot of different females there. But first, let's take a look at Italy, Bronze Age. So Italy, obviously, we're looking at these little areas. So we're going to look at Italy, BA, Bronze Age, Italy. And we can see what we see there, what ntDNA. And what I find interesting is going to be these mid green and blue L lines that we see there. Now, first in Italy obviously has a high Indo-European group, mostly some of those U6s, no, not U6, U's, and some of those V's there. So U, V's, and H's. And then we see in Italy Iron Age, we see a little shift. There comes basically some other mtDNAs come there, nothing too surprising, that's large. But you can see in North Africa, late Neolithic, you can see what it got there. Look at that giant V there, right? V or X. And then you got right here a T or R, right? And then right here you got a K. So that's interesting when you think about in that area of Africa and Neolithic. In the Neolithic, there was some K groups there, some ntDNA K, and some R groups, right? Think about that. That's Neolithic Africa. And then we get North Africa Iron Age, so a little later, and then you start seeing some L's pop up there. Notice that there's an L right there, and the L pops up in the Iron Age, Northern Africa. Now that's kind of interesting to note that it's not found down there in like Neolithic, Mesolithic, Paleolithic time frame for certain L groups. And we got to look at the L groups careful for those divisions. And we're going to note some supergroups. We can also note in Sardinia, Iron Age, not in the Bronze Age, but a little later, Iron Age. So in North Africa and in Sardinia, some L groups pop up there. It's going to be kind of interesting to note. So in this area, Sardinia, and in North Africa, we'll note some L groups that's going to be there in connection. So that's going to be kind of interesting. But they all got ties with a lot of those early movements around that area. Kind of interesting when you think about it, because we're going to point out some interesting things. I think it's kind of cool. This is just basically another way of looking at that right here. Basically, mitochondrial haplogroups in absolute count. So basically in each region and everything is just basically what we're looking at mostly. It's still the same. So L3 right there, L3 right there, and everything. But that's interesting when you note that what we're finding there. Here's another one. It says basically a study that they're going to have is archaeogenetics of late Iron Age. I'm not going to try to pronounce that. And basically investigating the material genetic continuity in North Mesopotamia since the Neolithic. So there's going to be a work investigating the human mitochondrial DNA, so mtDNA, from the PPNB from Syria, so northern Syria. So remember, I was talking about this area right here. So this is the Levant right here. There's the Dead Sea. This is like the Neolithic. This is called pre-pottery Neolithic, the final stage of it. And then right after the pre-pottery Neolithic time frame, what we notice, right, in the areas of northern Syria, right, Tel Halula, things like that, we're going to note some interesting movements that happen up there. So no doubt, when we look at the ancient lineages there, we can notice some interesting haplogroups that's important to note. So this, again, this is going to be Neolithic. And so this kind of gives us an idea of what percentages of groups we might find there of mtDNA. So we got some H's, right? We got some K's, right? We got some L groups there. So that's kind of important too, to note that in Syria, we're going to have L groups, right? Now, they say there's no L0 there up in Syria, but there's some L, like L2, L1, L3s, things like that. There's a certain super group family that we're going to look at. Why this L is up there in the north, moving throughout that area. It's going to be kind of important. You also got some other groups there, other mtDNA groups, right? It's going to give us some ideas of them, the other ones. I'm going to go a little down. So that's going to be, make sure I show that from here. So from Tel Halula, Syria, so there's going to be a study from looking at Syria and everything. All right. So you can see right here, so where's Syria? Right up here. So right there where that star is at, that's where those lines we're talking about. They said they found some L groups up there. All right. Close that. Any questions, statements, or anything, let me know, as we're on a free flow today in a way. All right, so let's look at this little thing right here. All right, so single dispersal of modern humans to Eurasia. Now, this was interesting because what we're noticing is that, remember, if you didn't know, it's important to know that we actually found out that there was a Neolithic bottleneck. And if you don't know about the Neolithic bottleneck, there's a couple different studies on it, on the Neolithic bottleneck. And that's what we actually was going over when we was going over the origins of basically modern humans. And after the flood, what events basically took place into after Babel, right? That's actually going to be important to note, the Neolithic bottleneck. And that's what this is going to talk a little bit about real fast. So right there, we're going to get a little idea about the Neolithic. So just talk about the Neolithic time frames and everything and what had happened. Why is this important? Because what I started to notice was that we started to see earlier humans up here in the northern area very, very early. And when I say early, is very, very early. And the only ancient humans aren't even modern humans in Africa. They're basically old humans, but modern humans start to pop up in Eurasia. Let's kind of talk about that on why this thing is interesting. The fact that both haplogroups exist in different parts of the world supports an alternative scenario of a single dispersal of modern humans to Eurasia. Samples with unknown radiocarbon and basically talk about certain dates, but it's going to be up M and N pretty much. They find basically M and M up there like 40,000, 50,000 years ago. Basically what they're saying on that, if you know, the Outer Africa concept consists that modern humans went into the areas of, what's the word I'm looking for, Eurasia around 60,000 years ago. But the problem is the Outer Africa concept breaks when they find a fossil that is a Eurasian modern human found actually in the areas of Eurasia. So modern humans, they say, wasn't in Eurasia. But this is what we kept finding lately as we kept going over the Outer Africa concept. If we look at certain studies of individuals in areas of Syria, we find that Syria had lines there for a long time in the lands of Syria. For example, this one says all over the periods from lower Paleolithic to the arrival of farmers, so that Neolithic time frame, those were farmers. That it said, it goes on and it's going to give us a little understanding about some things. I'm just gonna skip to this part to get right to the understanding of the movements here. That's important. It says this, illustrating. I'm just gonna right here. So basically, this is what we major need to look at. This highlight here to be highlighted. So we jump right to the meat of it. It says this about what I'm gonna show. It challenged the migration routes proposed by out of Africa diffusion models, right? Because it's actually going to show that humans were in Eurasia for a long time, typically considered to be basically corridors with a superior environmental potential, right? So these are actually things that start to date really, really long time ago in Eurasia. And I'm going to just show why I'm actually showing this on these things. It's because in the areas of Arabia and other areas, they had lines that go into areas of Eurasia all the way back. For example, this is why I'm showing that. You got some of the oldest footsteps in Saudi Arabia and things like that. When you look at the out of Africa model, this is what we actually found, a really interesting find. It says this: the first phylogeographic analysis using complete mtDNA genomic sequences dated the out of Africa migration around 50 to 70 KYA, when two branches named M and N, so of mtDNA, of the African, basically the micro haplogroups, are somehow breaking from L3, right? So basically coming from L3, supposedly began the Eurasian colonization. So they say supposedly that's what happened, right? This is what they say. M and M broke off from L3 and supposedly began the Eurasian colonization. But this is what they say. A more recent analysis based on a greater number of sequences pushed back the lower bound of the out of Africa migration assigned by L3, right? Very important, to around 85,000 years ago. Now, isn't it interesting how the out of Africa concept, they say is this time frame? They'll say, oh, it's only 60,000 years ago. Then they'll push it to 70,000 years ago. They find something older, then they'll push it to 85,000 years ago, because they keep finding the lineage that they don't want to find in Eurasia. And they say, if that's in Eurasia at that time, then that means that there must have been an earlier out of Africa concept, because these guys must have been in Africa, right? But no, it says this data is so far from the above commented presence of modern humans in Levant about 100 to 125 years before present. Why is that? Why is this number important? 100 to 125 years before present, because that's what they were talking about. That's what they were talking about when they were talking about L3. If you already know that when L3 was going around, they already knew that L3 actually showed evidence of a Eurasian back migration. And this is actually important to kind of point this out, that L3 itself would be Eurasian. That L3 itself will be Eurasian. And that's what I'm going to point out here. So you can see, remember how we talked about how L3 pushed those dates back and stuff and whatnot? But this is actually what they have found out. Let me actually open up a little note here to kind of point this out on this little thing. All right. Let me just point it out on here. All right. So then we talk about Tel Halula, Syria. We would just talk about that a little earlier. We would talk about some of the finds in some of these areas. And we talk about in Tel Halula that they had found a very interesting find over there, and that was going to be important for the following. Let me make sure, pop that back right here. All right. So right here, this was a study from, right, Syria, Neolithic Syria and everything. And it also let us know that they're grabbing some from Tel Halula, right? Tel Halula, Syria and everything. So that's got to be kind of important when looking at what I'm going to show right here, right? You can see right here in Tel Halula, Syria, they found an L3, right? We're talking an ancient find of L3, right? They said they found a skeleton, ancient time and pre-pottery Neolithic B of L3, right? And that's going to be like actual, like a find of it. And that's going to be important because they found others of it. They found a few of them, in fact. And yet this line, if you look and you study it, they'll try to say, no, it's only African. But actually, at this time frame, this will make you question what is an African fully. When it comes to modern humans, what haplogroups are actually those? So you got to be careful when looking at that. But the reason why I'm showing you this, because this study actually takes what is important to understand on how these years work. This fossil was said 8,000 BC. The fossil find was 8,000 BC. They took that fossil, and by the mutations, they say by the mutations on the outer Africa scale, it scales almost 125,000 years ago. And when I say that, I'm not saying that with exaggeration. I'm saying that in the sense that for real, for real. Here it says right here, it says based on the age of a micro haplogroup L3, right, from which all Eurasian, mitochondrial Eurasian, so all said Eurasians come from L3, and the majority of African lineages originated. So African lineages and Eurasian lineages come from L3, right, which I believe that was in Eurasia. Then a lot of lines became different lines, and some went to Africa. But it says right here that actually that line, as they look at the fossil record, they find out that L3 basically had went basically down into Africa, long story short. And that's what this was actually talking about. Eurasian origin and back migration to Africa has been proposed for the African Y chromosome E with L3. So that's actually important with this one. So we actually was looking at this before a couple times when we were breaking this down. The study on the Natufian here is where we went over that mainly on this one, where we had broke down a lot of that information. Very, very interesting and very important stuff. I think I misclosed something. There we go. I want to close that right now. All right, so the reason why I wanted to show you that is because of that information there. But let me go back. Probably don't need it now. All right, so you can see that information when we're talking about that L3, right? You see this little study, right? This is talking about basically that L3. So this study right here is actually talking about the origins of people. We'll talk about the actual way that tree works. So remember, there's different trees. There's your unrooted chart, the circular chart, circular graph, and there's your normal graph. There's different graphs, but an unrooted graph doesn't give you a root. That's why it's called unrooted. But you can use a rooted chart and find the roots, which are just nodes, because all that you got to find is the nodes, and then you can point out the fact of the root, right? And then you can just connect all the clades, the little separation from the nodes, right? But back to what I was pointing out over here, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about L3, and there's a supergroup. This is what they found out. So there's a difference between L0 and then another one called L1 to L6. And it's kind of important to note that it actually makes an L3. And it's important. The reason why it's important because if you think about the biblical narrative, in fact, that's what I wanted to do today as well, is paint to consciously, for those that are willing to, spread the truth in their own time, is to kind of take this concept into mind of how this thing is understood. Let's talk about the women. So a lot of people talk about Ham, Shem, and Japheth and everything, but let's talk about the women of Ham, Shem, and Japheth, right? So let's say there were 3 women from Ham, Shem, and Japheth. One, let's try it again. 2 and 3. And let's say they had their individual men, right? They had Ham, Shem, and Japheth, right? Ham, Shem, and Japheth. We'll make them different colors, right? So Ham, Shem, and Japheth. That's to kind of make it understood, right? So Ham, Shem, and Japheth. So they're all with a woman. And what happens is, let's say each one of these have a few kids. Let's say this stem represents a few kids, So a few different kids they have a few different kids, right? A bunch of different branches and everything that comes from this family and everything. So each one of these have a few different kids, right? Let's just kind of bring that out to kind of get it to what the stage is, to kind of connect those things. So each one of these are going to have a few kids with their own wives, right? So let's say Ham, Shem, and Japheth early on. Let's say there was no adultery or nothing. Let's say they all got with their own wives. So remember, our Faxad has his kids after the flood. Some of them might have their kids before the flood. So we could say maybe Japheth had some kids before the flood. Who knows, right? Maybe they had some that vanished. Maybe they had some before that didn't make it over the flood or something. And then the flood happened, and then Ham, Shem, and Japheth produced a lot of different individuals and whatnot, right? So let's say that all that happens. Now, each one of these had got with their own woman, right? Each one of these had got with their own woman. But let's say something happens. Let's say a generation later, let's say this generation, one of these men get with one of these women. Let's say he gets with a woman on this line and everything. And now this one who gets with this one is now going to have a woman with this one. Now, the reason why I'm showing you this concept, because I want you to understand how fast these mixing can actually take place. So this one can mix with any one of the women over here or any one of the women over here. And this one can mix with any one of the women over here and any one of the women over here. And they all of them can mix and interchange. And what does that mean? Now, let's first think about that. Now, these are not the first women, nor are these said to be sisters or anything like that. So that means that they had to come from someone, right? And they ultimately, all these women will ultimately come from one woman, as all women come from one woman and are all human. She would come from an ultimate Eve. So that means that from here, from Eve to the descendants of her and to the men, the amount of diversity that can happen is quite interesting. And let's say we take this time frame right here, right in this time frame right here, in the interlock of this one, and let's say that was a generation where all these had genetic ties to the same female. Let's say all these had the same ties to genetic female. Is she Ham, Shem, or Japheth? Right? Is she related to Ham, Shem, or Japheth? If all of them had the same female. Now, obviously, it'd be like different times. So it'd be like this one, and maybe this generation here, and then this one, and maybe a later generation, and then this one and this generation, right? But let's say she came from one of these women. So she would have the mitochondria from whatever mother she had, but she would also still have the autosomal mixing from these different females. And also from the men. She'll have a mix for the men, because the women don't really make a tribe. She would fall under whatever tribe she mixed with. Why is that important? Because let's keep on continuing on to kind of point out something here. I'm going to point out a little bit of this mtDNA. Now, there's an ancient, let me also point out this, make sure I did for this little thing. This is just talking about some of those ancient groups that we were talking about right here. And the reason why I was pointing this out, because I'm just going to set that right there for a second and point out something on this. They found some ancient mtDNA groups that were actually in the areas of, what's the word I'm looking for? Eurasia. So you can see right on this branch over here, on this branch, on this side right here. I don't even know how you say that name. Datani. You can look right across it, and you can see it's on the side of L3. So L3 is going to be on this side, on this corner here. The reason why that's important, because you can see that it actually will connect to some ancient Homo sapiens. But those ancient Homo sapiens, the location where they're at is actually kind of interesting to note. So I'm going to kind of pull that up and kind of point that out. So here's just a distribution of the potential Neanderthal signatures in modern human mitochondrial genomes. So that's something that's actually interesting to note, that some of the female lineages had got a little bit of the Neanderthal admixtures in them. You can see some of the mtDNA that they'll talk about here. Some of the classic ones are the U groups. You can see right here. So some U groups here. There's actually going to be, watch what, actually, these are actually really old as well, mtDNA groups. Let me just read before I point out something on here. So we'll just talk about some of the mtDNA groups that they found there, but they said 52 contemporary Homo sapiens, right, with representatives of major worldwide mitochondrial haplogroups. So look at this. When they're saying with the Neanderthals, what groups we see there, obviously U5 and everything, U8, some U's, different types of U's there, right? You got some M groups there. You got some R groups, some B, right? But you also get some H groups, and what's really interesting is this Neanderthal L groups. Remember those L to 6 groups, L1, L2, L3, L4, L5, L6? We need to pop out a tool and open up the mtDNA tree. They have an mtDNA tree in development. And what they found out is that early in the mtDNA tree, this is the Y tree, I need to pull up the mtDNA tree, is that apparently early mtDNA groups have mixed with different individuals. All right. Just gonna let this thing open if it does. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. There's a site that is still in development. All right, we got a quick little freeze on his page or something. All right, we'll let that go. That's just a little mtDNA tree thing. Sometimes it works. They're still developing on it. Here it is. All right. So you can see here's basically your early line. So that's your root of your mtDNA. Notice this about the female lines, that early human lineages was split into different groups of Denisovans and Neanderthal lineages. And let's say about here, let's say about here on the splits. Let's say about here, Noah ends up hitting the picture. Does that mean that Ham, Shem, and Japheth women could have had an ultimate subclade of some of these groups? It's possible. It's highly possible that Ham, Shem, and Japheth's women could have still been an ultimate subclade, an ultimate subgroup. So think about that when we go over this, because that's what we're going to look at real fast. We're going to look at some of those supergroups and their combination with these things. But you can see there's a supergroup right there. And look where it says where it's at. It's in Siberia and in Russia. So you see some of those supergroups actually in Siberia and Russia. That's actually kind of interesting when you think about it, is that these supergroups and these ages, you got to note the ages here. Note the ages. This right here, that's 50,000, that's 60,000. 65,000 years ago in Russia, that's 50,000 years ago in Russia. You can see what's going on here. The other ones, they're a little younger, because that's going to be their said ages there, or not. But we can see that supergroup will be up there. And notice here, we're going to go down a little bit and look at some of the present day Homo sapiens that's used in the study. Know that they use a couple different ones. This one we don't need to look at because it's just present day or modern haplogroups. But they did find that when they looked at modern haplogroups and the mtDNA, they found out that some had connections to different Neanderthal mixtures, like the one L. Chiron. L2 has a connection to L. Chiron. And L2 and L1 has connections to L. Chiron too. And some L3 D groups have some connections to some of those groups. Now, when someone thinks Neanderthal, what is a Neanderthal? This we got to be careful of, because a lot of people think Neanderthal is like some private group of Japheth or something. But a Neanderthal is like an ancient human. If you compare it with the biblical narrative, a Neanderthal is like pre-Seth, early family related to Seth, because you got to remember, Seth, before Noah also had women. So the women that were with Seth, or the individuals before Noah, those will also be counted as ancient individuals. So this is just ancient connections of ancient women with ancient humans. That's all that it really is. But notice also L0 was up there too. So we had L0s with connection to these groups. And we're going to have a lot of different groups with a lot of different connections to northern groups. So it's a complete list of mitogenome positions where present-day sequence are identified with Neanderthals. So you can see what's going on there. A lot of different ones. We got some L0s as well, with some different ones in L Saran. A lot of different ones in different areas of the said Neanderthals or ancient humans, right? We can see a lot of different DNA groups, mcDNA groups that would have connections to Eurasia and everything, right? A lot of L0s, L2s, L3Ds, L4s, L5s, L6, and a lot of different M's and Q, mcDNAs, Z's, C's, different ones that have ties to ancient Eurasians and everything. Talks about a lot of different ones. I'm not going to put them all out on this list, but you can see quite a few, right? I just talked about the main ones we wanted to talk about and everything to kind of get a good understanding of that, of these ties to Eurasia. That kind of is important and kind of interesting to note. So they're going to be settled in these upper areas in the north. They're going to be settling in these upper areas. In these different areas, they're going to have connections to Eurasia. That means that these lines long time ago would have connections to Eurasia. That's going to be important to kind of note. Because if they had ties to Eurasia a long time ago, then that would mean that the biblical narrative would make sense, as it says that all the nations were basically dwelling together, or people were basically united. There was not no like separate people of black or white or anything like that. That was just a people that started to become their own people. So we got to look at haplogroups and stuff to kind of conclude what's going on here and bring the pieces together. All right. So there's going to be some ancient ones that we're looking at here. Some very ancient stuff that's going to be in the areas of Eurasia. But these are important because it lets us know the potential of who can possibly become Israelites. And from the looks of it, almost any one of these has a chance because they're all over the place, right? So we're going to kind of pin it down to a few or to a one, however we can do it. But I think this one is the most important because certain different documents that come together, and we're going to point out with some things, right? So taking these new rates into consideration, most dates estimates would be pushed back by a factor of 2, for example, yielding a West African non-African split date of 90 to 130 KYA. So they like, how old is the African out of Africa concept, right? Which is up to, they just talk about 60,000 years ago, older than previous studies, right? It just goes on and talks about some calculations. I'm going to skip down to right here so we can talk about the exact haplogroup and its information and what's going on here. I'm just going to click this so we can get to the meat of it. All right, so this is kind of interesting. It's just going to talk about major events in human evolution occurred far earlier than previously thought, studies suggest. Now, the reason why it's talking about, evolution, all that stuff, we're just going to talk about some facts real fast. So we was talking about some of these groups like this one. This is going to be where that 7 is right there. This one right here, let me just point it out again. Right on here on this list, you can see this one on Dotsney, something like there, 14. And that's actually going to have connections with that L3. And you can see it right here on this map right here at 7. It's going to be right there. And it's talking about basically looking at some of the mitochondria and stuff and whatnot and find out they're in Eurasia at that time, because they wouldn't have a problem if it was in Africa at that time. But because that group was in Eurasia, it hurts their model. It's hurting their model. So here it is, L3 right there.
And they're basically looking at it and they're like, well, L3, at the same time while these groups were there, it was up there as well. At the same time with these groups being up there and early while these groups were up there. So it's like they're looking at this division of this family, and it's like, is it only African? Was it only destined to only be in Africa? Because if I type L3 on Wiki, it'll tell you that it's an African lineage. Then you start looking at ancient stuff, then you're like, And the reason why I'm saying that, I'll show why in a little bit. But watch what it says right here. Nevertheless, the fact that haplogroup L3 is currently so widespread within Africa suggests that the population split between L3 is likely to be one of the most important ones in history of separation, given a rise to lineages that contributed, right, substantial functions to the ancestry of both present-day sub-Saharan Africans and present-day non-African populations. So L3 is actually going to be very important to kind of take a note of these things, because it's going to kind of give us a pinpoint understanding of what's happening with these groups, right? So we're going to kind of take a note of what's happening here with these groups. So right here, furthermore, haplotype matches from Africa are also exclusively confined to West Eurasian R0A. So remember, we was looking at some of those things. We was looking at some of those groups, surprising groups that are actually in Africa, when some would think that it would be like L3 or some other groups, but it's all interesting mixed. It says haplogroup in the southwestern Yemen, although more sub-Saharan L-type matches appear in more northern Yemeni populations. So this one also talks about how some groups migrate down and go into areas of Yemen, start moving into areas of Yemen and everything. This is important too, because when you start looking at ancient ties, ancient family ties, and you realize that, areas of Arabia, Yemen, Levant, all these play ties to the biblical narrative. All these are actually important for areas in the biblical narrative. All right. So this is going to be some little interesting area right in the coast of this area here. But they found some interesting finds there. The reason why I want to show this is because I was looking at this L3 group. You know what's funny? I'm showing you this L3 group. It says that as an African group and everything. But I was basically going through some of the L3 information on like some of the L3 pages on like Facebook. So here's like Facebook. There's different groups that talk about their lineages and stuff. And then some like, oh, I'm L3, I'm this, and that and everything. And then you get a chance to kind of like see how people look and everything. You'll find what's what I'm looking for? Some interesting things. Like apparently this person right here is L3. So this person right here is actually L3. They said, "Oh, I'm actually L3." Others had said they were L3. I thought that was very interesting. The reason why is because of some different information you can find concerning L3. Now, I'm not signed in, but I put this here because this goes through a list of different L3 groups. One of them in particular was actually L3F. I'm going to show something real quick with L3F. So here's actually from that Y tree tool. So you can see it's going to have some other different ones. But notice something with L3F. L3F is going to have a lot of different lineages in Spain. So this L3F is actually, a lot of them are in Spain. You're going to have connections with Egypt as well. No doubt Lebanon. So right there in the area of Israel. These seem like they might have went across seas into Brazil and America. That's important because I'm going to point something out when we're thinking about who are like the nations and everything. Who are these different ancient nations and whatnot? Who could they be? So different areas of Africa, the Middle East, and dispersal. So you can see Saudi Arabia, Israel. So there's L3F all up in Israel, all up in Saudi Arabia, Saddam, right? Lydia, no doubt, right? So it's got some presence in a lot of these ancient areas. We can get a good understanding of that. Iran, Iraq, right? And that's just one. That's just one snip. That's just one snip of a major family that I think shows major ties to some important events. I'm going to point out. So first, this little piece of area. Why I was kind of pointing out this little piece of area there. The reason why is because I was just doing some studying on some ancient places and whatnot. And I was noticing some interesting mtDNA groups, like, for example, some L0s that was in Arabia and some L2s in Arabia, Saudi Arabia, a couple of L2s in Saudi Arabia, and a couple of different L groups that was in a couple of these different areas. And these would be from basically that area of Yemen. And that's what some of those L3 groups that we was talking about. You can see L3, L3F, 1B right there. So those were those groups that we were just looking at. That was basically spread all across in different areas. But it's saying that they would have ties to this little area that they would be at. Right? The reason why I think that's interesting, here's a little area that had connected to. The reason why is because that group were Arabs. It was an Arab tribe that was over there. And those Arab tribes, you know, when you look at the genetics there and everything, they have a lot of L groups there. And when I'm speaking about, like, you know, L groups and whatnot, let me get back into a little more into why I'm saying this. So here's a big map of where L groups were. Where L groups were. Let me just show it on the screen here, as I think it's important. Yeah, I'm gonna point out that thing with King Solomon. So right here, if I put L1, L1. All right, so, and let's put his descendants. All right, so you can see L1 would have had some ties to different areas over here as well. If we put L2, you can see this one has some ties in these coastal areas and over here, whatnot. Also, L2 comes from Tel Halula, Syria, from the Neolithic, as well as L3. L3. So they say everyone comes from L3. As you can see right here, they say all these female lineages come from L3. And they start to settle in all these different areas here. You can see what's going on there, right? That's L from L3, it says. And then it got its mid snips, like L3A, right? L3A got a nice portion right here. You can see that right there, right? L3B, you can see some in this little corner right there, and some settle in the upper areas of Africa, right? L3C, right there, right in the corners of Arabia. L3E. L3E, this is the one that I think has ties to some early Israelite groups, because we found these in different areas that are going to be important, like Tel Halula, Syria. But this one itself, as you can see, in connections to the Sinai and Arabia, this has a lot of importance in history. So all across the upper coast here, right, into the upper Mediterranean. It's going to be kind of important. Also L3F, right? That's another one there. So that's going to be one that's going to kind of give us some important information with these, right? L3E, snapshot of that right there. If we also look at, let me actually go over here. If we also look at something, let's look at the root of L3. And let's see what others also say about this L3 line. If we look at like its foundations and stuff. If we go to SNPs, we can see basically what we was just talking about when we talk about some of those SNPs. So right here, there's that supergroup. It's telling you where L3 comes from. So before we get L3, in groups of Arabia and other groups, we're going to note that it's going to come from areas, as you see these dates here, it's going to come from areas of pretty much Eurasia. So it's connecting Ethiopia and Arabia. So that's actually important to know that this is going to be connecting this whole continent, this whole area together. So, and that's what we was just looking at when we was looking at those fossils of those groups. We was looking at the ancient ones of those groups, right? So we have the actual ancient fossils to know that, yes, this is an actual ancient group that is Eurasian, right? So you can see that without a doubt that it has some Eurasian ties. You can see some other places that L3E actually has connections to. You can see right here, Israel, Jordan, right? They say Jamaica, America, Yemen, right? Ethiopia. That's important for the placement ties. Here's some of those ones I was talking about. So Eurasia, there's that L2, 3, 4, 5, 6, pretty much that super SNP. You can see what's going on there. So we got 2 of those in Eurasia, right, with the other Eurasian ones, right? So that's very important that we do have these groups in Eurasia. You can see that without a doubt. So that's something that we actually know, that it makes sense that L3 had early presence in Eurasia, and it makes a few Eurasians. And it's important to kind of note that with these groups. So I said Donnell, or something like that. It's Dolnell, something like that. And it's letting us know that in these, and this is talking Paleolithic time, no doubt. They're saying that some of the oldest groups are in Eurasia. And you know what's interesting? There is no L3 in Africa. That's these ages. If someone has an L3 in Africa, these ages, let me know, because then we can go over those things. I'm going to advertise a Discord page real fast. Let me actually show that. The reason why is because the next piece of information is connecting the Israelites. You see why I'm showing you these L lines and some of these H lines and some of these V lines and some of these lines? Because they kind of merge together into an African culture, right? And what do I mean an African culture? I'm not even kidding. I'm gonna show you what I mean. I forget that I got that weird thing going on with my Discord. Let me combine some of my beloved brothers' servers together so I can get to his. All right. So I already told them I was going to show them their page, as I want to bring some information on some things. Let me read you something that is really interesting from 2021 by a historian. So if you don't know who this is a very famous historian. Sorry if I say his name weird. Was that Tudor per fifth, something like that? I said his name weird, but this is a historian. He is a British historian, right? So he has a lot of studies in the Jewish history and connections of Africa and stuff like that, other groups and whatnot. He goes into deep topics. And let me show you what he actually talks about here. He actually talks about a deep topic. This is what he says. You know, I want to say this because a lot of people, they fall in some of the crazy Kanye West doctrines, right? He has a crazy doctrine, right? He like believes what's the word I'm looking for? That the Nazis are good guys. They're not. Nazis are absolutely horrible. But the history behind them actually reveals some things. Let me read you some things that Peter says, the historian. However, a few years ago, when I was reading an obscure 8th century German book, I suddenly realized that our current interest in color of the Jews was not new at all. So our interest in the color of the Jews is not new at all. So the missionary author of this German tome had noted that a slave, now notice what he's going to say here, that a slave had said, that this German writer had said, that the historian was reading. He said a slave from that tiny West Africa kingdom of Lingado had mentioned that in his homeland there were black Jews who celebrated the Sabbath so strictly that they do not speak a word all day, right? Their graves are made of monastery and adorned with figures of serpents and lizards painting on by those who come to bury the corpse, right? So I just say they see them, they're there. They say, indeed, the black Jews of Lingado and other black Jews of India, like the Siddhis, the Sahara, the Ethiopian, watch what it says here about those Jews, were a fundamental and critical building block in the outward construction of the concept of race, both in Europe and America. So you see what's going on there when we're looking at these things. But this is going on saying, are the Jews black? That's what he was writing. He's writing, are the Jews black? Right? He's going over some information. But it's kind of interesting because remember how I just talk about some things that I was just talking about real fast on about groups of controversial groups and whatnot and things like that. He actually gets into some things that I think is kind of interesting, that I think is really interesting to go over. And I'm just going to go down to a part here. So we just talk about this part here. But let me read what it says right here. Watch what it says here. From the middle of the 19th century into the Nazi period, the idea that Jews were multicolored played into the basically, the idea that was going on in the land, that if you look hard enough, all Jews were actually black. They say they were black in the sense that they had black blood, and they were also black in the most literal sense that their skin was black. Even if you could lulled into thinking it was kind of white, right? Allude to it if you was thinking it was kind of white, right? But it's saying that basically when you're looking at the blacks and you're looking at the Jews, apparently in the 1800s, a long time ago, and I pointed this out, that Europeans and other nations were calling the Jews black, right? He says, I examined assumptions about Jewish color for hundreds of years, right? Which actually lets us know that it says in absolute and fundamental Nazi conviction that Jews were negroid. So they say that the Jews were negroid. That's actually something that's actually interesting to note when you're going over these things and kind of point out what was happening in those areas. But this is what they actually know, is that when they go to one of the index, right, Bedo's achievements was so, right, one of I don't know if I'll say that Bedo's achievements was so create basically what he wanted to do was make a certain index of, they was making an index of what was black and what was white and stuff, and basically this is what they have found out on one of their index, right, of the populations of Great Britain. It said the Jews scored fully 100% on his Negro Science Index. I don't know if I said that right, in those Negro Science scenes, something like that. Looks, I don't even know, obviously that's a made up word. His little chart, it said that the Jews apparently came up as Negro. Now the reason why that's important is because what we're basically saying is that if you really look deep into some of the older finds, like Moses, he was described as looking like an Egyptian, and I showed some of Ramses II tombs, and that would have, some people say that's the time of the Exodus, and if they're comparing some of the Egyptians to how Moses looked, then they look kind of similar when you kind of look at some of these things. So this is kind of interesting when you kind of get a little look at what's happening here. But the reason why I wanted to show you this is because I'm gonna show something real fast that I think is important on these brothers' page. So we talk a lot about a couple of different things, right? A lot of different things, to be honest with you. But we found something that I think was really interesting, and I was waiting for a while to go over it. And I'm hoping these brothers, make a little video on it, because the find is so impressive. And the reason why I say impressive because we were just talking about Abraham going into Egypt during the Middle Kingdom and then leaving during the New Kingdom. Now that sounds like a very pinpoint time. It is a very pinpoint time. And we wanted to find who exactly were the Israelites. So we had to find something very pinpoint, a group going into Canaan and then going into areas of Egypt during the time of the Middle Kingdom and during the exit of the New Kingdom. So that's kind of important to kind of get an idea of who was all there. So looking at that time frame of Abraham, I just took a little second to go over some information that we had went over, and I realized something. No doubt we already had proven who were the Israelites, but let me actually point out something that this brother actually has showed that I thought was very legendary and very important to point out. So let me actually show that on here. So I think this is kind of interesting and kind of important. A little bit up here. So it's going to be basically evidence of a certain line from the 18th to the basically 18 BC to 12 BC that has some interesting movements down there and makes a major change. And the reason why is because I was trying to find out when did E1B1A exactly start to find its real origin and stuff. And it starts to divide in Eurasia, but then it goes into a couple of different other places. But let me actually point out this right here. So this little paper that he brings out. Watch what it says here. It's what it says is as history of basically long story short, Y chromosome variation in Egypt. Long story short, basically Y chromosomes in Egypt. But let me jump to the part that I want to show you here. Now, this is actually got to be explained carefully. And I want you to understand when I say this, as there's a couple different sources to provide the evidence of this. Let me show you what I'm showing you real fast on here. You see what you're seeing here? Now, it may not look like it, but these are haplogroups. You see this 4 right here, this I and V, this is 4. And then this V right here is 5 right here. This is actually going to be, right here is going to be E1B1A. This is actually E1B1B. That's what actually these are. This is going to be E1B1A. This is E1B1B. We know because there's a couple different papers that go over these. It's going to be a haplogroup 4 and haplogroup 5. And those are going to be important. But what we actually find interesting is that obviously E1B1A is higher in Nubia. So E1B1A has higher portions in Nubia than E1B1B. But E1B1B has higher portions in Egypt than E1B1A. And in Upper Egypt, we see that E1B1A and E1B1B are evened out and everything. But the reason why that's interesting is because also E1B1A, looking at the time frame of the groups that are going to be in connection of Africa and the Near East countries, we actually find out that E1B1A actually is positioned between Egypt, Lebanon, and without a doubt, the areas that would be circling around that area, right? Palestine and a couple of different areas. We know that it reaches some areas of Iraq and everything. So we know that this line actually has some ties to those different areas. And we actually know they actually are in the Sephardic Jews at 8%. So they know that they have a high portion of them in the Sephardic Jews as well. Now, the reason why I think that's interesting and important, because this was a line that they said had no ties at all to Israelites. They'll say it had no ties. Now, the reason why I say that's important, because connecting that with some of the Israelites kind of makes it start to look like, we got to look at these things a little more closer, because this little highlight right here, right? So you can see, right, 5 was E1B1B. It says a high, just talks about E1B1B in Ethiopia and South Egypt and everything. So that's something that is important to note. But we also know that these are going to give us like movements of the Near East Europe and other places in the post-Middle Kingdom. And also it's going to be the New Kingdom, which I'll point that out real fast, because that's what this actually is. It's fine. It's actually kind of is really, what's the word I'm looking for? It's really interesting when all the pieces is put together. So let me actually just point out something also from that right here that I think is kind of important. A little bit more from it. It just talks about the most common variants and whatnot and all those things. But it also lets us know about, like I said, E1B1A. It labels it sub-Saharan. That's just because I don't know why they call E1B1A sub-Saharan African. But they let you know that it's in Nubia and whatnot. But what's really interesting is that this group is actually found in the areas of Arabia and Egypt in the time of the Egyptian dynasties, and it catch connections with Nubia and other groups around there. This kind of interesting because it kind of gives us a pinpoint time frame of when this group starts to exist in that area, right? So that's what we were just looking at when we was looking at that group and its ties to these certain ties, right, of Levant and the ancient Jews. Now, when I say that they had ties to the ancient Jews, this is actually something that I'm now going to go to our server where we talk about roots and everything. And I want to point out something here, because when we're talking about, in fact, let me point it out here, because I want to show a little highlight to something that I think is kind of important. Let me just go right to it so I can point it out on here, because it was a little bit back, but it's important for the topic right here. All right. So this is kind of interesting. I just want to say this because I think this is important. So Will, son of Yah, has shared this, and this source right here tied so much stuff together. The reason why this source was important is because it tied the African admixture to the beginning of the Jews, to the origin of the Jews. So we're talking like right after the Exodus. As it says right here, it just lets us know when it's talking about the sub-Saharan admixture. It says that it goes back up to the Babylonian exile to the time 3,400 years ago at the time of the Exodus. It says, and that's important because at the time of the Exodus, a lot of those groups became a clan of Israelites. They passed through the Red Sea and became a clan, an official agreement, a clan that started to basically grow together, right? Your daughters marry my daughters, and my daughters marry your daughters, and those clans were becoming one. The Israelite clans were one. That's why you'll notice in the laws it would say, like with the Edomite and the Egyptian, they become one in the third generation, and that's why they were kind of blending together, but with largely overlapping intervals. And this is what it talks about. I'm going to copy this. The Mizrahi, right, Iraqi Jews. So Iraqi and Iranian Jews, we actually can note that they go back, as it says, 2,600 years ago, right? If you go back 2,600 years ago, these Jews go back 2,600 years ago, but they say they share a signal of African admixture. So they had an African admixture in them. And it says, so remember, Mizrahi Jews with an African admixture. In the date of the African admixture, I'm just going to go down where it just talks about right here, the 8th and 6th century BC. We know that these Jews will go back that far, but it says the dates that emerged from our roll-off, right, analysis in the non-Mizrahi Jews could also reflect events in the Greek and the Roman periods and everything, where it basically talk about a large number of Jews were in North Africa and Alexander. That's why I was showing you North Africa, because a lot of those lineages early on went to areas of Africa. In the Jews, it would make sense for the Jews to be an African culture because they go and they develop in the areas of Africa. That's important. That's why it says Assyrian that went down and then went into Africa and increased to a large people. So history of African gene flow into Southern Europeans, Levantins, and Jews. So it says the gene flow went from the beginning. If we go a little deeper, we notice something with right here. This is actually going to be from what you say, study.com. So study.com, guess what study.com said when it's talking about V38's descendants? It goes on and talks about V38 and its descendants. It says remains found in modern day Israel were analyzed and confirmed to carry this haplogroup, dating as far back as Natufian culture. That's why a lot of people don't know that V38 is actually in Natufian culture. That's why we got them saying that V M2 has a back migration, right? Connection with the onyx and stuff. People living in the Levant, right? Eastern Mediterranean of the Western Asia some 14,000 years ago. It should be noted, however, E1B1A originated about 40,000 years ago in the Horn of Africa. That's not true, because E1B1A has no actual fossil finds or any ancient finds in the horns of Africa. And Natufian are 39,000 years ago in the lands of the areas of Levant. E1B1A is older than E1B1B, and we did not find E1B1As in Africa 40,000 years ago. And if someone has that find, right? If someone has that find of E1B1A 40,000 years ago in the Horn of Africa, share it. Speak up, because I kid you not, in all honesty, I was searching for that source for a long time, and I could not find it. Could not find it. It's like almost like a conclusion that study.com just drew on there, like, hey, wait, I know that we just said that this line was in the oldest culture of the E groups, the Natufian, right? And I know that we just said that this group also was in the Levant, but somehow, some way, they're actually in Africa, in the Horn of Africa. Where? They don't tell you the culture, but they sure tell you the culture right here in the Natufian for this one, but they don't tell you that 40,000 years ago in the Horn of Africa, because it's not there in the Horn of Africa 40,000 years ago. Otherwise, that'd be one of the conversations of a high talk with the Natufian. But they talk with the Natufian and the Iberasians, which are not on the east side of the Horn of Africa, but on the area underneath Spain. So only group that is contemporary with the Natufian is all the way by Spain, not at the Horn of Africa, especially not at that age. It says this predates the first Israelites who lived during the Bronze Age, and thus not a specific genetic marker to Hebrew ancestry. So now they throw that out there. They throw that out there. It's just like, oh no, it can't be Hebrew and whatnot. It can't be Hebrew. But watch this. Watch what they say here. Answer and explanation. Here we go. Present day E1B1A clade is predominantly found in Western Africa, followed by Central and Southern Africa. It has also been found in a lesser extent in Northern Africa and the Middle East. It is also present in modern populations of Mizrahi, Palestinian Druze, and Bedouins, all whom have ancestral ties to Israelites. Wait a second. Why did they have to throw this on there in a false finding that there's a said 50,000 years old E1B1A in the areas of Africa? And there's not. There's no E1B1A that old in Africa. We know because otherwise you have to connect it to what culture it is. Notice that they don't have a name of a culture. They just say it's at the Horn of Africa. It originated there. From what? CT or E1B1? That makes the Natufians, right? They don't tell you that, nor they tell you the culture. They just want to tell you supposedly it came from there. From what? CT? E1B1, right? E-M96? No. So that's what's important, that they let you know it's from Natufian. And they let you know that it also was in the Mizrahi Jews, just like we just pointed out from the study right here, from this genetic study, how we found that inside of the Mizrahi Jews with a genetic mixture that mixes and goes all the way back to the origin of the Israelites, we know that this actually is going to be in the Mizrahi Jews. If we go right back to that study, it tells you right there, it is also present in modern populations of Mizrahi Jews, right? Palestinian Druze and Bedouins, all whom have ancestral ties to ancient Israelites. Remember we was talking about the Omic groups, E1B1, when we talk about those groups, when we talk about E1B1 too is found almost uniquely in southwestern Ethiopia, especially among Omic cultures, right? So that's that Mota that we talked about has a Eurasian back migration, right? So we know that it's going to have some ties to Africa, no doubt, but we have ties to also Israelites by its ancient standards and to the Levant by its ancient standards. That's going to be important. Let me show one more piece of information from another channel real fast. This one I like to help out because I like that when people are hungry for information to look at the origins of stuff. I'm going to point this out here because I think this is kind of interesting. All right. I had pointed this out before, but I think this is kind of interesting and important as it's talking about basically how the Jews look. So I'm just going to shotgun through it. So this is from a book right here. And this book is basically facial image of biblical Jews from Israel. So it's looking at ancient Jews and looking at what their face looked like and everything. What could they have looked like and whatnot. And this is what they say on there, some highlights. Based on its facial reconstruction, the male skull may belong to the large Mediterranean group that inhabited this area from prehistoric to modern times. Watch what it says about the female. The female skull also inhabits all the Mediterranean female features, but in addition, probably some African mixture, right? Manifest by the shape of the reconstruction of the nose. Can you make a mistake of an African nose to like maybe a thin nose? So if you got some Israelites with some thick African noses, you got to ask yourself a question. How did all of a sudden their noses start to change? How did their noses start as a negroid style and all of a sudden now it's kind of different? It didn't really change that much. If you actually look carefully at the ancient original Jews, a lot of them still have a major African admixture, but a lot of Jews, you got to note this, have a European admixture too. We're going to point that out as well. And how is that so, right? If you look through the scriptures, you start to notice that a lot of Israelites, right, were men. They came from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but they started to mix with nations that started to settle in that land. And a lot of the nations that started to settle in that land were women from Japheth. And the reason why I say that, in all honesty, is that Japheth started to migrate down into the areas of Levant because there was a Bronze Age collapse. There was a lot of disasters happening in the area of Europe, and a lot of Europeans were making a massive migration down into the areas of Canaan and Africa. But also groups of Nubians were moving upwards. So it was like a hot pot. In Avaris, it started to become a hot pot where a lot of different nations were surrounding that area because it was right after the famine of Joseph. So right after the famine of Joseph. So it lets you know that a lot of those female groups had African features, right? And it goes on, it says African mixture manifests by the shape of the reconstruction of the facial features. So you see what's going on there. So this is going to be kind of important. So it's letting us know when connecting these pieces, they're all coming together and they're making a lot of sense. So facial image of biblical Jews of Israel, right? They say indeed, from what they looked at, they say when they look at some of the information, they say scholars often assert that a strong European tradition dating back to the Middle Ages maintained that the Jews were black. Wait, wasn't that what that historian was saying? Even though it was kind of controversial when he was saying that, we'll look back at that what that historian was saying and some of those things. But it says in the Middle Age they were saying that the Jews were black, or at least swarthy, and finds sharp expression of modern anti-Semitic literature. Right. So isn't that interesting? You call a Jew is black, but for some reason they was hating the black Jews, and you would think back then that would actually be Semitic. Anti-Semitic, I mean. So that's kind of interesting when you think about that. That in the medieval literature, a theory prevailed in which the Jews were part of the black race, or at least dark-skinned, or that the general look of the Jews was considered to be like that of the blacks, right? So that's something that actually is important to take a note of when they're looking at the historicity of the Jewish blackness, right? A thesis revisited. So it's looking at what it must have looked like back then with those different groups and whatnot. Could they have been all tied together? Looking at some of the Portuguese Jews, you can also look at something interesting. So we looked at some of the Portuguese. We looked and seen that they were Dory-Kossophatic. We know that Dory-Kossophatic was obviously something that had ties with the negroid race. So having a negroid skull is actually kind of interesting. And when I say negroid skull, I mean a negroid skull, as is definition, Dory-Kossophatic Negro. As it says, today it is characteristic of the Negro race of basically different ones, right? So that's kind of important to note as we go over these things. So that's just a quick fly through of that. Going back to this over here. The reason why is because that's a hot take. That's a hot take. That's a hot take because if you think about it, we got a very, very close tie of what looks to be groups that some may not consider and constantly said that, oh, these cannot be Jews. But we end up finding a African mixture with almost an Indo-European admixture in them. If you be careful and look at said African Americans, you'll notice something very uniform. And you'll notice that they're not always the same haplogroups, though they do have, in some portions, large E groups. There's also some R groups among them, other groups among them, right? But they have a mixture of majority of L females, mostly of certain types. But the ones that we want to look at, like these ones of the Israelites, they get with a lot of those L1, L2, L3, L4 groups. But we also got a super group of the H and V groups. So it's like a V group or H groups, because these also had ties to early Israelites, right? They are mixed in with the early Israelites. And we also know that there's L0 groups there. So that's also important to know because we know that L0 had mixed with one of the groups that was in the Levant. And we know that if L0 had mixed in the Levant with one of the groups that were Canaanites, it could be called a Canaanite. And then also we know the Israelites, some of them had mixed with Canaanites. That's important to know that they mixed with Canaanites, Amorites, Hittites, different nations all around, right? But most of them tried to stay true to what they were. But there were some that rebelled. There were some that went their ways. And that's what happened. But the ones that went to Spain, per se, those were the ones that were the Jews. Now, what makes them special is that they would have ties to Jehoiachin. So that means right after Nebuchadnezzar came there, when the Jews were taken, some of them went and got shipped to Spain by the Chaldeans. They got sent to Spain and they developed to a Negro culture, a Negro group. And they got sent to San Tome y Principe. Why I'm telling you that is because that's what this study is from. It's a haplogroup basically composition obtained for the basically Jewish descendants from San Tome. And if you want to know what the groups of San Tome had looked like that were sent over there, we had pointed that out before. But notice they have a European and African admixture. So, but what's important is just like what a lot of individuals had pointed out, was it that they were European and got an African admixture, or were they African with a European admixture? That makes a major difference. Were they first African and had Europeans grafted in them, or were they first European with Africans grafted in them? What we actually found out is actually they had a African majority component and a European grafting in that had happened during the time of the Exodus. So it was a combination group, but majority of African. That's why you'll see right here on this group is almost 90% of said E1B groups. But also it has some of the said European groups on here, like R1 groups. That's actually kind of important, but it also has some mtDNA that are European. And I met some brothers who actually had mtDNA groups of females that were European, right? And that's something maybe I'll talk throughout the week of some of those groups that were found. But what's interesting is some historical quotes. So we know that the Jews of San Tome y Principe, there's historical quotes that tells you they went down there to San Tome right here. For example, King John in 1492 expelled all the Jews, right? Expelled all the Jews is basically what it's saying on here, right? So he expelled all the Jews and banished the Jews and whatnot, the Black Portuguese, as they were called. And they were also called the Negroes, as they were descendant from Lingado. Didn't we just talk about Lingado? Jews of Lingado? Wait, Jews of Lingado. Remember that we just talked about Jews of Lingado? That's actually what this individual was talking about. He says, indeed, the Black Jews of Lingado and other Black Jews of India and in the Sahara and Ethiopia were fundamental and critical building blocks in the outward construction of the concept of race, both in Europe and United States. Right? Remember, this was a historian that's telling us these things. That's telling us a major thing, right? But it's telling you there's Jews in Lingado, right? So that's why they was talking about back then in the Middle Age, were the Jews black? When they talk about Jews of different areas, the Limba, right? The Limba are black, right? And a lot of people know that they're Jews. The Igbo are black, right? Ewe, different ones. These are black Jews, and a lot of them were taken overseas. And this is just something that happened. And the reason why is because of the way not a lot of people know of who orchestrated the slave trade. It was the Portuguese. And the way that they did it and who they did it to was orchestrated a certain way as well. So that's why it's talk about the study of the Black Jews and everything, and the connection of those different groups and whatnot, right? So that's why we was getting into that topic. But there's a little more on here. I want to point out something on here that I think ties it together a little bit more. Let me just point it out up here that I think is kind of important with this topic. So we talk about a lot of different things. We talk about that split that Nathan Jensen did, right? Splitting at the YAP negative CF groups, which are Japheth, the YAP plus groups, DE, which are Shem, and the YAP negative A and B groups, which are Hamites. That's actually important when we had talk about that split and everything. There's a major separation of lines that happens there. But let me read you something from this family tree page that I think is kind of important. It talks about an E1B1 group, and it gives us some very important information about it in the time of 650 BC. So that time frame is about the time of the Assyrians and everything. So about 650 BC, we actually know that this haplogroup right here, this one right here, that is actually going to be E1B1 group. Long story short, E1B1A. Maybe I'll show it on a snip tracker. I'll just open these to kind of make it understood. So let me copy one of these to put it on the snip tracker, unless I already got it on this right here. Right here, there it is. So I'll show you what snip I'm showing you. As you can see, it's going to be from E1B1 from V38 M2. And you can see, obviously, this has lines in Saudi Arabia, lots of lines in Saudi Arabia, as you can see there. We got in Arabia, Kuwait, right? This line here. But let me see if it got a thing to open. I'll just show it right here. All right, so, but what it says in 850 BC, it says that it had ties to Arabia. It said it was in Arabia, it was in Oman, it was in Kuwait. So it's letting you know that some E1B1A groups were already in Arabia. They was already in Arabia in the time of the Israelites movements and stuff. So it gives you great potential if this line could be an Israelite. Especially if we know it was in Arabia and everything, if we know that this line was down there moving throughout Arabia, Yemen, and different areas all around. If we know that this line was one of those lines moving throughout these different areas, then it just makes sense to imagine that this line could be a representation of a possible Israelite company, right? And the reason why this is important, because it starts to tie what's going on in the lands of America. Why these people starting to stand up and say, oh, we're Israelites. Could it be that they might be? Could it be that maybe we should take a second and maybe study if they could be, and maybe make some room for the individuals that might be Israelites and whatnot, right? Not gonna hurt anybody if it's so, right? If there's extra Israelites living around the world, right? We just gotta, get them to walk in the exact way of make sure that all pops in. Amen. I know, isn't that something? Isn't that something that and I was waiting to see if somebody was going to share a source on that, but I did not find any E1B1As in Africa 40,000 years ago. There's no way at all to find an E1B1A that old. That's why, isn't that just interesting how they do admit that E1B1A had ties to Jews, and we got historians that tells us that some of those Jews were black. And we got studies of the Jews being mixed with ancient Israelites, not modern Israelites, ancient Israelites. So it's letting you know that this line has connections to ancient Israelites, and it has connections to Jews that were sent to Spain and privately sent to an island and developed in that area for a long time, and had became basically its own little culture there and stayed there for a long time, which matches all the historical evidences and exactly what the historians were saying when they were telling us that different groups, different said black groups, right, Negro groups, were actually living, right, as we had pointed out earlier right here. Indeed, the black Jews of Lingado, right, just like that thing was saying, right, from Lingado, right, as we had talked about these Spanish Jews and where were they sent, Jews in Lingado, right? And then we had seen the study on them of these Jews that were sent here, right? The Jewish descendants sent to Santa Fe, right? But they're right there, also in connections with Santa Fe, right? St. Thomas, Santa Fe, and Lingado, right? And that's what it's getting understanding. Indeed, the black Jews of Lingado and other black Jews in India, the cities. If you haven't seen, right, the cities, let's kind of show that real fast. We talked about that before about the Jews and their Arabian persecutions, and not a lot of people know that the cities are actually connection to those E1B1 Jews. These are going to be in connection with those groups, these groups here. So you can see Y-DNA. You can see here's that E1B1 and whatnot, and other groups in them and whatnot. And then some of those L groups that we were talking about and whatnot, some other groups that will have ties to this group. The cities that said that during the Arab slave trade, they were sent into areas of India and everything and other places all around the cities, right? So you can see right there, around the time of the Arab slave trade, when the Arabs were persecuting the Jews, right? The Battle of the Fosse and everything. And that's going to be very important. They also, some of them go into Abyssinia connections with Abyssinia. But we know without a doubt that they had an increase of the groups of the Bantu groups from the Portuguese. Who you think the Portuguese had? That's actually what that study was talking about. That this was from the Portuguese sending the Jews down to Santa Fe, as it tells you right there, St. John, at the areas of Portugal, right? The Portuguese settlements and everything. So it's making perfect sense, as it sees right there. Black Jews of Lingado and other black Jews of India and Sahara, right? Africa and Ethiopia, Africa, right? Were a fundamental and critical building block in the outward construction of the concept of race, both in Europe and United States, right? So that's why we have pointed out, so that people understand this part, that the Nazis were convinced that the Jews were negroid. So that's important to know, that a lot of people don't know that they were calling the Judaism a negroid's religion, or Negroes religion. Not a lot of people know that they were calling Judaism a Negroes religion, and it was calling Jews Negroes. But as things started to change up in 19th century, right, started to change up as the British had took the areas of the area of Levant and they gave it to who they wanted to. But this is important to note for roots. But look at how far back that goes, right? That's no mistake in these things that we have these type of connections, but we got to look a little deeper because it's starting to slowly tie together as we take all the sources that we have and put them into display Now, if we look at L3 itself, L3 is in a lot of different areas, right? If I do a quick summary on some places, is in areas of Iran. So this area here, 18 BC, L3 in areas of Iran, is in areas of Europe in the 2000 BCs, is in areas of Elam, is in a couple different areas, is in the corded ware group, yes. L3 is also with the European corded ware that had mostly R1b. Why do you think that L3 also mixed with an R1b, and that R1b started to later mix in with some of those Israelite groups, also still with those L3 there? So E and R starts to have some interesting ties together because of its early ties with earlier lineages. So L3 also was over there with the Europeans. And it also had connections to lots of different cultures. I would say one of the interesting ones is Syria and Tel Halula, Syria, and everything. That's definitely one that I think is worth mentioning. So L3 has a lot of different locations it was at. In fact, some studies say that, when they did the Out of Africa concept a long time ago, they had found out that the LT was derived and rooted in Asia. So that was something that was actually important to know about when we're thinking about groups like L3 and things. Also, remember, I had pointed out this before that L3 was also in the Gasulians, right? In the areas of the Levant, right? L3 was in the areas of Levant. So L3 in Israel, that's Levant, no doubt. You can see Pequot Cave, right? Gasulians, right? So mostly T groups was also with Gasulians, but they also had E1B, E1B in those Gasulians. But there's a sister lineage of L3 that will be there as well. You can check a SNP tracker, right? Or in a sense, some other movements, right? So later on, this is where L3 goes. So you can see later on, first it starts up here. And then later on, as it goes to different time frames, like modern time, it starts to make its way into Africa later on, modern time. But the older ones are in Eurasia. So older, Eurasia, later, they go into deeper areas of Africa. So that's going to be very important to note for this line. So it can have upper ties to Eurasia. So that's very important to note. But the most important thing why I'm showing this is because these two pieces right here. Let me just show something when I'm talking about this L3 and whatnot and these groups. So this is another one looking at those Eurasian groups or not. When it's looking at some of the groups that were in Eurasia, they know that without a doubt, long story short, I'll just point out the highlight that they indeed found, as it says, these super haplogroups include the L3 lineage that is common in all non-Africans. You see what's going on there? That is common to all non-Africans. The remaining 6 individuals could be assigned U6. So they found L3 up here in that upper coastal area. So L3 has some ties to Eurasia, but what's the word I'm looking for? Let these things load up first and then point out on this. All right. And this is one of those studies we was looking at early on for those super groups. When we was looking at the super groups and everything, there it is. So you can see some of the super groups. We see those division groups there. And we also know that they had apparently L3 up there as well on there. I don't know why it's not searching on this thing right there. So there you go. So give me the assignments. So there's those super groups L2 to L6. So L2 to L6. And they also say right here, these super groups include the L3 lineage that is common in all non-Africans. Now tell me this. Why is it that this modern human group is found in Eurasia, Its ancient node is found in Eurasia, comes from that node in Eurasia, develops in Eurasia. Then in modern times, it goes into Africa and is called African because it's in Africa in modern times. And then they say because it's in Africa in modern times, there's no need to say like anywhere wherever else is at, right? And if you know what I'm saying, as anyone who got a genetic study and got L3, and they got almost no information, none. And I know it's because I witnessed it myself that someone with L3 did not get any of these things. They did not know any of these things because the information to all those things is set in the background, even though all the fossils, all the ancient finds are in Eurasia, not in Africa. So once you start connecting pieces by its actual observable finds, you start finding some interesting stuff. So you lineage with L3. Can you imagine that? What is you? Is you African? Is you U5, U3, all those things African? What about L3? That's found with these lineages. All right. But the reason why I say that is because it's not only solely locked to Africa, but it does go into Africa. But we do see that it has early divisions in the upper coastal areas. So that's kind of important because it's factual ties. So you can see right here, these are ancient groups that would be in the upper areas and everything. So just to kind of get a little show of that indeed they found some ancient groups up there. And this is just connecting with some others U groups. So obviously they found U groups there, but they found L3 groups. You wouldn't even think that they found an L3 group. If I had reported this, I would have wanted to identify that they also found an L3 group in this ancient time, but they didn't want to show that. It's on the papers. But they do have BT up there. They got C groups up there. They got CT groups up there. They got F groups over there. So that's very important. So BT is very interesting because that's an early root split. Might have ties to some of the Hamitic lineages or other lineages, right? Other lineages around. But that's important to note that these groups will have ties to those upper coastal areas. So this one could just be an early split node with CT. So BT, CT is actually your splits. So apparently what it's saying is that L3 was obviously in Eurasia with the early splits of early humans, right? F-M89, F groups with CT and BT groups up there, with its early C groups, right? CF groups are early Eurasian groups, right? So that's very important to note. But let's close that. So a little more into it. African L haplogroups was found in what? Both Jewish populations, right? Indicating a significant African mitochondrial contribution, unlike other Jewish dispersal populations. So this is going to be the pure Jews I'm going to show. So a high frequency of sub-Saharan L lineages in these said Jewish populations in areas of Yemenis. The Yemenis Jews and the Ethiopian Jews, this is what we found. They say that they have basically a high portion of those L groups. So they have a high portion of L, but they also have some European groups. They got some R, some J, mcDNA, and M groups, but they have a high portion of L3 and L2. So that's something that's actually important to know. They got some HVs there as well. But that's very interesting because you will never think that L3 or L groups would represent Jews. Mitochondrial DNA reveals distinct evolutionary histories for Jewish populations in Yemen and Ethiopia, right? So we're talking Horn of Africa, right? Southern Arabia and Horn of Africa area, the Jews, right? And we can see what's happening with these populations and what they have in them and everything. As we see, a high frequency of sub-Saharan African L haplogroups was found in both Jewish populations, right? That's very important. Very, 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 very important. So that we can kind of get an understanding on the possibility of who are Jews, what are Jews, and what are in Jews, right? Who is excluded from being a Jew? This is a really interesting question that was answered on Quota. And I thought this was really interesting because it was just talk about some languages and everything. But I just thought it was kind of interesting to note some things on this. But watch what it says right here. This was an answer from a linguist that answered on Quota. And he says, what we can tell from these inscriptions, so he's talking about certain inscriptions, I'll point out, is that Egyptian and Semitic were already very different from each other at the earliest date. At the earliest date, they share very few basic words in common, and each had clearly undergone numerous changes, right? Just talk about the changes and everything. Obviously, both of them are in family of Afro-Asiatic and everything. But it says much the same can be said about the other branches, right? Like Omic and Chadic, say that they have some difference. But guess what? Omic has a large group of E groups, and Chadic has a large group of R groups. That's really interesting when you start noting those things and whatnot. But this one I just put here because it's interesting to note family ties. And what a lot of people don't think about is that Ethiopian has some Semitic branches. And when I say some Semitic branches, they have like southern Semitic that is actually going to be very important. But sometimes they call it Cushitic or Omitic, things like that. But you can see right here, those will still actually be a Semitic language. That's important. Just like Berber, right? That's still Semitic, like Chadic. Those are still Semitic languages. Those will be Afro-Asiatic, still going to be ties to Semitic. Now, they want to be under the Semitic branch, but if you actually compare them equally, they're going to be still close in family ties. So that's going to be kind of important when looking at some of these things. We had talked about that before. I'm not going to go into it right now, but this just talks about that where they separate and they branch off. That just lets us know like how close of the family ties to Semitic we would get to tie the ancient groups together, right? If we connect their linguistic nodes. This one is just something that is just extra I noted, but all these groups like Africa and Levant are Afro-Asiatic, Semitic, and they can be easily Israelites. They can easily be groups that either mixed in with other cultures and whatnot. Because a lot of groups today that spoke Semitic speak Indo-European, a lot of them, and that's not nothing to be shocked of because that's what invasions are. Invasions, that's what happens sometimes. So you can see just from the top of here that there's a high potential of what I see as the L groups, most likely, especially L1 to 2 to 3, 4, those mainly L2 and 3, those ones may be the highest links to being the original ancient Israelites. Now, there's other groups that could have had grafted in with them later on. But I think in its origin, they were a negroid grouping, that they would have been an early negroid grouping and they would have been more diverse than a lot of people may think. But it talks about indeed, groups could have easily, like we said, Jotanites went down into this area and right at the area of Punt went into areas of Abyssinia. And then the Nubians would have been in ties with the early Shemites. And that would have been very important for its early development. That's why we actually look at linguistic tables and we see that all these areas were Semitic. So it would make sense that even deeper areas of Africa would be involved with groups that later became like Berber, like C6 right here, Proto-Berber. That's a Semitic linguistic family. So that's a Semitic family that actually is important to note, like even Chadic right here. So Chadic is actually in the center of Africa, but that's actually still an Afro-Asiatic family, right? Would have still on the same family branches, Afro-Asiatic, and Chadic, right? Semitic and Chadic are from Afro-Asiatic, right? So that's very interesting, and I think it's very, very nice. Now, I usually don't show stuff like secular sites and stuff like that, or stuff that anyone can answer, but this was actually a linguist, so I thought this was actually a very interesting answer. So I wanted to share a little bit of that Africa has linguistic ties to the dispersals of different groups that could indeed have ties to some of these groups that would be Israelite groups. So we can see that that would make perfect sense, especially for the understanding that the Natufian sat at the cradle of the Semitic divisions that became the Akkadians and Arameans and things like that of that sort. That is very important for us to understand origins. So very important for us to understand origins. So I'm going to use this little thing to kind of make a clear understanding for why we're going over this. We're going over this because we're now wrapping up the final piece of our multi-video playlist of the origins of all people. So this one actually is going to be a summary on the end of this video that we did yesterday, because I didn't get to talk about the genetics because it was just going to take too long to get into the genetics at the same time while going to historicity of Abraham. So that's why we're doing that today, going over the genetics. But any questions, let me know. I gotta make sure I put this block the madness is going on, right? You stand strong, family. You know, we almost there. Amen. You couldn't mix the two. And when I say Jew, I mean Ashkenazim and Sephardim. Yep. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. If E1B1B doesn't appear in Africa Horn, yeah, I know that is always interesting. Amen, family. Amen. Amen. As always, we gotta go about these things. So let's dive. We are not finished yet. Let's dive a little bit more on why E and L is most likely the Israelites, and that every other group started to blend themselves with them. They started to merge themselves with those Israelite groups. So you'll always find in the Jewish culture E groups, especially E1B1, and you'll always usually also find the accommodation of R groups. And you're going to sometimes find a combination of, no doubt, L groups in these groups. So L in the mtDNA. But you might also find European groups in these groups. So why do I say that? Let me actually, remember yesterday we were talking about basically Avaris and who was at Avaris and everything, groups at Avaris and whatnot. And what we found out was that the Nubians were at Avaris, right? The Nubians are going to be a group that developed very early, right? In the lands of Egypt where Israel was, Avaris. So Avaris is going to be important for us to note. But I wanted to point this out. Some important genetic ties. That's going to be important to know about Avaris. First, let's point out the fact that Nubians were at Avaris, right? We got evidence of Nubians being whipped and beat, right? They're saying they're Nubians because they're black, right? They look at them, they're at Avaris and they're dark skinned, and they got ties to Nubians and everything. But we got to remember that Nubia still had ties to Afro-Asiatic, right? And Semitic groups. So that's going to be kind of important for us to take note of as we go about this thing. So let that load in because these notes are fairly big. Let that open up. And this one, because this is where we're going to point out the fact of what's in the Nubians. What exactly is the genetic information saying about the Nubians and what they got in them. All right, so let me point that out on here. If I could scroll down real fast. I'll just scroll to it because if this little thing won't search, I'll just point it out. There it is. All right. Right here, notice what we've seen on some of the finds. For example, here it says Semites, or right, Semitic groups, right? Semites and Nubians are shown fetching the mixing mud and water, right? Striking them out of the bricks. So it talks about they saw slaves of Nubians. They saw slaves of Nubians in some places. We also seen that obviously where Avaris was, the Amorites were down there, but we also knew that, as it says, besides Egyptians and people from Western Asia from different periods of immigration, Avaris proved more and more to have been a multi-ethnical town. What else did they have there? They found evidence that there were Nubians there, right? Physical presence of Nubians, right? Africans, right? A lot of people know what a Nubian is. It's no mistake that there will be some African groups over there. Well, what we actually find interesting is that if you had seen some recent information that came out without a doubt that there was a siege at Lachish. So Lachish had a siege, right? Lachish had a siege. Let's take a look at that real fast right here. So they had used a magnetic field and found out evidence of destruction layers, right? So this just came out a couple of days ago. So Earth magnetic field supports biblical stories of destruction of ancient cities. So we got to know that really there was a destruction on the ancient cities. And one of the cities was a city of Judah, right before Hezekiah was attacked 2,800 years ago. So what would be 2,800 years ago? That would be about 800 BC, 800, 700 BC, somewhere around there. So, and we know that the mixture of the said groups, the Mizrahi groups, actually goes all the way back, right? So that's something that's important to note, that the Mizrahi groups go all the way back into time, right? So that's going to be something that we're going to take note of as we go about this. But we know that E groups were over there in Arabia and areas of Levant in that time. So this is going to be kind of important to take a note of as we go about these things. So it's going to be kind of important to take note of as we go about these things, right? So just making sure with these other things that we had touched, I'm just going to close some of them so it don't get too thick, too much stuff over here and everything. We will need that. I'll leave that right there. We don't need that and that. All right. But this is what it says, a magnetic history of biblical brutality. So it talks about all the way back what happened 2,000, 8,000 years ago, right? So take 2,000, right? 8,000 years ago. So, that's right on the money that we were just looking at. But what it talks about here is that what we can find here is that basically the Assyrians have marched downwards. And what they did around the time of 800 to 700, right there, 700 time frame, we know that they have reached, let's look at that. They have reached down these areas. There it is, Lachish. You can see Lachish when they touch Lachish right here in this conquest, 700s. So between the 800, 700 time frame, we see Assyria is attacking what? Evidence that Assyria came down and they actually are going to sack the city of Lachish, right? So third and the second layers are going to be hit. So boom, they go down there and they hit Lachish. Why is that important? Because we actually found out that there were Jews at Lachish and we found their bodies because what the Assyrians did dating back to 800, they actually stacked up their skulls and whatnot. But for some reason, they also found paintings dating back to 800. Jewish articles prevail, they say, which flourish many specimens of black figure Greek pottery. So they got some pottery that looks like the style of the Greeks when the Greeks start coming in a little later, right, as the place gets invaded and everything. But what they did find was something that's interesting right here. Watch what it says here. The fact that a modern population from the north of Abyssinia stands between the ancient Egyptian populations is interesting. But far more evidence would be required to basically talk about that relationship. But here's why I want to show you the highlight. Watch what it says here. All right, watch what it says here. The relationship between Lachish series may now be considered. So they've been studying on Lachish for a minute, right? All its closest, right, connections are with series of what? What are they related to? Lower Egyptian type. And these are close enough to suggest that the population in Palestine's town and in the Palestinian town was entirely and almost completely of Egyptian origin. Watch what it says about those groups still of the ones that we've seen at Lachish. It says The skeletal material from Lachish is believed to represent people who died about 700 BC, which is the time of the 25th dynasty of Egypt. So you see what's going on there? So wasn't Israel going back and forth through Egypt? You think Israel would have ties to Ethiopians? You think Egypt and the Nubians will also have ties to the Israelites? When, remember, Solomon married an Egyptian, right? So why wouldn't he have already ties to movements that the Egyptians would make in that area? How powerful he was, right? Him and the Egyptian leaders had allegiance, but later on, his sons still had ties with the Egyptians and different groups all around. We know because we went through different, what's the word I'm looking for? Family trees that describe the connection of the certain families at that time, and with these certain groups. But notice that the genetic study is saying that Lachish has a population that seems like they're related, as it says, with men and women that were basically intermixed and everything. They said they were intermixed, but it says that the people at the Lachish area obviously had to be groups that would have ties to Africa. So it's letting you know that the groups would have ties to Africa. We can look a little more detailed at it to get a little more understanding on these things. As it says in Lachish, talks about those groups, Mediterranean groups represented. It says Lachish maintains a stronger Egyptian and Phoenician affinity with European and Northern African affinities, right? Secondary. So you can see what's going on there, right? Wasn't we just noticing that with the Jews of San Tome, that they also have some small European admixtures there? So remember, is it that the Jews started African and got a European admixture, or did they start as European and get an African admixture? They started as African and got a European admixture. That's very important. So as they migrated into that area, they started to mix with, as we know with the Exodus, with nations that they were leaving with. So they were leaving out and they were picking up a combination of different lineages and everything. But majority of them would stay in the sense of an African admixture, right? So they're looking at the dental evidence of those groups, and they're finding definitely some major connections of those things. Let me make sure I show where that source was coming from right here. So this one was earlier, just from something from the Jewish Encyclopedia of Lachish, right? And it's looking at basically some of the evidences that happened there. So no doubt the king of Assyria was at Lachish during the time of Hezekiah and everything. This is written in the Kings, but it's also a lot of different evidences for the destructions that happened here. So we're going to look at those things on this, right? Go down right here. Make sure I had showed that from the source. Right down here. Let me just make sure there's nothing on that. All right. Seeing on that. Lachish, nothing there. Oh, yeah. This one just talks about, obviously, like we was talking about. It says of the traits, it says, and a more in-depth look into possible biological contributions from Mediterranean, Egyptian, and Nubian groups. So they wonder if they had connection with some Nubian groups there, right? In Lachish. Make sure I point that out as we kind of point these things out, right? Because we see that they, as they say, the dental traits show they had some Southern Levant connections and Northern African connections and everything. That's very important, right? Very, very, very important to kind of look at these groups at Lachish and their connections, what groups they are connected with. So it's basically letting us know of their Afro-Asiatic ties, right? So population continuity or replacement at ancient Lachish, a dental affinity analysis in the Levant. So you see what's going on there with these groups and whatnot. Is definitely taking a look at these groups and comparing them and finding those admixtures in them. Now, if you also look at some of the descriptions of those Jews that were taken at Lachish, they have what looks like a very negroid look, They have a very negroid look to them. That's what it looks like to me. And even a couple of different illustrators who are illustrating how they look were saying that they kind of look more negroid than anything. But that's what they found at Lachish. At Lachish, they found basically what you see here.
History shows that both Amos and Micah's
I'll just show this 1 minute video so that if someone never seen the history of this, they can get a good understanding of what is happening.
The prophecies seem to have come true. The kingdom of Assyria invades Israel in 722 BC and destroys Samaria, its capital, less than 40 years after Amos's prophecy.
In 722 BC, the Assyrian Empire conquered the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom of Israel and scattered them to the winds. Isaiah warned the people of Judea that their kingdom would be next if they did not confront their shortcomings and embrace compassion.
Up them on sharpened poles. They would make pyramids of heads and pile them up at the entryway of a city.
And now, a new transition for the Israelites' vision of God is about to occur. It would come when the great empire of Babylon conquers the Israelites and forces them into exile. Within this turmoil, God would finally move beyond the struggle. In 586 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon conquers Jerusalem.
All right, so the next part of that is just talk about Nebuchadnezzar. But first, I wanted to show you what the Assyrians did. So it's a lot of history on that, how the Assyrians came down there. They destroyed the Sumerians. The Assyrians are the ones that took the northern tribes, right? And then they destroyed a portion of the Jews. But Lachish has the Jews. That's what makes it important, that Lachish has pinpoint the Jews. So not like just the mixed nation of Israel, but also the Jews, right? So that's why he's looking at the population continuity that will be there. And that's why it lets us know that as they see, he concluded that the collection was largely heterogeneous, right? Basically saying that they had genetic ties. And they basically found that they have close affinities to North Africans, Egyptians, and what else? Nubian groups, thus claiming that Lachish collection was a Egypto-Nubian presence. So the Israelites were Egypto-Nubian. Who looks Egyptian-Nubian? Let's see let's first take a look. Let's take a look at what the Jews look like during the time of Moses. Let's take a quick look at what the Jews look like during the time of Moses. Now, whether you're late Exodus or early Exodus, it won't really matter because I got images for both of them. But I am firmly believing that there was a late Exodus, and that Ramses II may be the Pharaoh. Why is that important? Because let me show you what it looked like, right? Because remember, Moses was said he looked like an Egyptian. Now, I know that there are mixed Egyptians everywhere, but look at this tomb here in Ramses II tomb. Let me show you what we see here and what the Egyptians look like. Remember, when Moses was moving around, it's like, aren't thou that Egyptian, right? So he had to look like Egyptians of that time, right? Just like Paul, when he said he looked like an Egyptian and everything and whatnot. This little tomb right here that I think is important, as it says right here. It says, this tomb is the service, is of the servant in the palace of truth in the reign of Ramses II. Ramses II. So you're going to see what Egyptians look like during the time of Ramses II. So we can see what the Egyptians look like, right? So look what he said the Jews look like first. Again, what did they look like? North Africans, Egyptians, and Nubian groups, right? So they look like Nubians. And I'm just going to type it down so you, right? It should be easy to tell what Nubians look like, Nubian people, right? Very mixed culture style, but there's no doubt that they're negroid, right? There's no doubt that they're negroids. So could you imagine going to Jerusalem ancient time and you're walking up and you see a little Jew that looks like this? Would you be anti-Semitic and say, hey, you don't look like you should be there? Right? We should be able to kind of look at the concept of what the historical information is saying and what the genetic information is saying, because we know without a doubt that Assyria did attack Lachish and everything. And we know that Lachish would have obviously evidence of an attack. And if we find bodies, guess what? We can do genetic research and find out what they were connected with. And they had affinities with North Africans, Egyptians, and Nubian groups. So they had connections to Nubians. So that's what the Israelites would look like: Egyptians, North Africans, and Nubians. That's what they would look like. And now let's look at what the Egyptians look like, what Moses was compared to. You can see the females there, right? You can see her tone. We can see that they have fresh color in this place, but they had made sure they colored their faces, and they made sure when they had put those designs, some had bleached hair and relaxed hair and stuff, but you can see what they look like, right? If I said to you that Moses looked like an Egyptian, and then all of a sudden you see all these Egyptians walking out, what does that tell you about Moses? That he might have been a man of complexion. He also married a woman who may have been a Cushitic woman, right? And that's also important because the Midianites actually went into the areas of Africa. That's important. We know this because the writings of Flavius Josephus talks about some of the Midianites that he knows was in Africa. But this tomb right here was during the time of Ramses II. So that's what the Egyptians look like. We can also look at some of the women, like for example, Ramses' wife right here. We can see what she looked like. There she is right there during the time of Ramses II. So we know that, was this the woman that took in Moses, or was it a different woman that took in Moses? Might have been a different woman. Might have been a woman before him, or who knows? One of them took in Moses, and that's going to be very important. So that's something that's important to note. So a lot of people had dark skin. His individual we know have E1B1A. Look at his skin tone. If he has E1B1A and he looks just like these Egyptians, because some people try to say, oh, that's because the Egyptians like to make people look red and stuff. They like to make them look dark. Well, what haplogroup is Ramses the third? What haplogroup is Ramses the third? And why does he look this color, right? He looks the exact same color like the rest of these right here, right? Be careful of the description I talked about is a real thing called whitening out, changing the images, the original images, and changing them to something else. You don't want that to happen. You don't want to look for images and come across some sketchy images. But look at that, Ramses the third and his pigmentation on his drawings, all right? And we can get a good idea of different shrines. So here's a Ramesside shrine right here. And you can see how these individuals look there. Moses looked like an Egyptian, they said, right? That's the Moses. It's a Moses. So for those that think it's that time, look at that woman. She's light skinned. So I already said that Egyptians also have light skinned individuals there, but you got to remember to be careful because the Mitanni was giving their wives, the Indo-European Mitanni was giving their wives to the Egyptians, right? If you don't know that the Mitanni are Indo-European, right? I'll just show this little picture right here, right? And remember, the oldest groups in Egypt were A groups. That's what this little source right here was. I was talking about earlier. That haplogroup A-M13 was found at highest frequencies in the Neolithic samples of Egypt. So A and B is more the deeper African ones versus the ones that we're going over. But here's a picture. Here's Mitanni. This is the Indo-European group that the Mitanni actually have ties to. The Marianu, something like that. Marianu, but the Mitanni actually were the Hurrians. So that's important to know that the Mitanni made ties with Egypt, especially those R1B lines, Tutmosis and stuff. and most likely gave those KMTDNA European groups to Egypt, and they started to migrate down there. Now, that doesn't mean that K is only light skin. It can have darker skin too. So that's very important. But the ones that we seen from the Mitanni were lighter skin. So that's important to know that Moses, and some of those lines, right? Certain individuals of Egypt were hooking up with daughters from the Mitanni and other nations. But they wouldn't give out their daughters for some reason, because that's just how Egypt was. They just wanted to take, but not give. So as we can see some light-skinned ones there, but that's during Moses' time, right? But Ramses' time, it started to look darker. You can see how those individuals look, right? You can see those Egyptians. There's no mistake of what's going on there, how those Egyptians look. Here's some more pictures of some Egyptians, right? Get an idea, no doubt. They will look just like a regular negroid individual, right? We even got science that tells us that we know that Egypt got more negroid. It actually became the opposite of Europeans, what they have found out. This is what a real study was saying, right? It says people expected that through time, Egypt will become more European, but we see that the exact opposite. We see the exact opposite, they said. And this was something that they would talk about. The reason why I'm showing you this, because, you know, we are providing real evidences instead of just saying black and white. We're looking at the theory from the inside, and we're trying to see if it's possible. And from what we're seeing with historical evidences, it's not just that it's possible, but it's most likely that something had happened during like the 18th century, right? But the Israelites may have been darker skinned negroid race. So remember, we see that the Egyptians were, as it says, modern Egyptians by comparison share much more DNA with sub-Saharan populations and whatnot. So we can see what sub-Saharan is. So sub-Saharan, if we say sub-Saharan, we can get an idea what sub-Saharan is. So that's very important to understand. So Egyptians tied with sub-Saharan, that kind of interesting. I think that's just going to be important for knowing, again, that this is what the Egyptians look like right there. So not a big surprise, and especially not a big surprise when we start realizing that the Jews, again, have affinities to North African, Egyptian, and Nubian groups, thus claiming Lachish, right? The Lachish collection to have an Egypto-Nubian presence. Isn't that interesting? And then we just verified that there were Nubians in areas of Avaris, right? We just point that out. All right, we just point that out. But let's go down and get into it. So this is the stuff that I couldn't go into when I was going over those things of the Levant, Bronze Age, Iron Age. But now we're getting right into it. So you can see right here, even it says that 17 traits from Dothan and Lachish were compared, right? Looking at the basically groups, and this is what they found out. They had ties also with said Natufian groups. That's just a little extra thing was drawn there real fast when they're looking at those ties of those groups. Long story short, from here, I'll just show that source. So right there, bioarchaeological analysis of culture transitions in the southern Levant using dental nomadic traits. So this is what it was just talking about, just in comparison with the Natufian. And remember, we found out Natufian were Proto-Shemites. So we found out Natufians were Proto-Shemitic groups. So this is very important. Very, very important. So we know that there's also a lot of ties to these Semitic African groups on how they go into Africa. A lot of brothers go into these topics and everything. And maybe I'll point out something of it, because I think there's a lot of interesting topics. This one, it's kind of interesting. Let me go to something on this. These are some interesting topics that I think that's worth going over. Let me point out something on here.
Well, in certain areas of Africa 3,700 years ago.
So a lot of people, when they first hear that, African Israelites African American Israelites, they say, oh, impossible. These people they're putting on a performance act. But then when you start looking at the historical documents, let's say somebody let's say they hear one of the groups they don't like. Let's say that's an African group or a group of dark-skinned Israelites. They say something you don't like, and you're like, none of them are Israelites. Not one of them are Israelites, because I don't like this group and what they said to me or what they said to these people. They're anti-Semitic, so I don't think no Israelite is black. This is what happens, and the reason why I'm saying this, because when you offend who you're trying to convince, you make it hard to convince them, because it's not that you can't convince them by logic. It's just that the emotional parts are getting in the way. So try to set the emotional parts while we're going over these things to point these out. Because I'm not saying that no one else can be saved, but I'm saying that maybe we should consider who are actually the ancient Israelites, just for the sake of truth, because it's just interesting how this individual group that is said dark skin feels so compelled and so driven to say that they are Israelites. And you're like, where did that all come from? Right? Gotta be some truth to
He
it.
is the 34th king in Obugad. But apart from that they have maintained this kingship and dynasty, other Israelites are equally in Igbo land. We have Zebulun, we have Ephraim, we have Menashe, we have Reuben, we have Danites. They are all here.
You know how many articles they have of Jews saying they went down into the lands of Africa? The different amount of groups saying, hey, we're Israelites, but we're in Africa now. There's a lot of different groups that are saying these things, and it's because there's a lot of history that's also saying these things. Let me show this one. I thought this one was interesting too. Let me just show a piece on this one, because I thought this was kind of interesting that this brother showed on here. 407. So he shared something kind of interesting on here.
Were indeed still from Africa. So to go through some history, I'm going to start way back in ancient times and speak about the Israelites going into Africa, at least as it was mentioned by Mar Zutra in the Talmud. So it states in the Bavli in Sanhedrin 94a, to where were the tribes of Israel exiled? And Mar Zutra answers, to Africa. And there's a couple of other sources that are basically repeating this verbatim. This is, of course, a part of the story of the Ethiopians, a part of the story of the Igbo, the Jews of Nigerian ancestry. This is a part of the story of the South African Lemba tribe Jews, whose genetics have since been linked to the Levant region, meaning their origin is not of the South African region, but it's of Middle Eastern region, which is a part of their story. They say that their ancestors came from Israel and migrated down to South Africa. And among the Lemba tribe in South Africa, you have some who have been tested to have similar genetics to the Kohanim that are found amongst Ashkenazim and Sephardim and Yemenite Jews. And so there's even a genetic link there. And of course, everybody knows of the Ethiopian Jews of Beta Israel, who for the large part have all migrated to Israel. There's still a couple, or maybe a few thousand left in Ethiopia.
All right, so if you haven't seen this, I'm gonna put these in the description, and this is gonna be on this note of Inquisition and Assyria. Sorry, I know I got that Inquisition all twisted in my tongue. Inquisition and Syria. That's important because the Inquisition in Syria has some interesting similarities when you take a major look at what's going on. But this is why we're looking at this, because the amount of information that's seen in a lot of these ties actually ties very deep, very, 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 very deep is what I'll leave that at, is that these tie very deep. But look at that, Lachish. That's Lachish, real Jews, and the fact that those Jews went into the areas of Africa. Why do you think I kept saying by the actual fossilized cultures, E1B1A has no Mesolithic, no Neolithic, or no Paleolithic fossilized finds. That means that it must have started somewhere after the Neolithic transition. And that means that it could easily be descendants from Abraham because how young it is. It's so young. It just pops up out of nowhere. And all of a sudden, other lines start graphing themselves with it. And it becomes this nation. But one more time, just to make sure we understand this, Lachish, indeed, the area that was besieged by the Assyrians in the exact time frame of the Assyrians, the exact culture, right? Not Bronze Age Lachish, but Iron Age Lachish, and the Lachish that was besieged by the Assyrians. We know that those groups exactly, right, had an affinity of North African, Egyptian, right? Egyptian, right? Is not that Egyptian? Let's real fast. Let's read a little bit of that real fast so that we can get that into our heads. That the biblical narrative is a narrative that brings many people of many different professions together. But one of the biggest things that it brings together is a broken people. It brings together the broken people first. That's what's really important to understand here. Look what it says. Look what it says in some parts. Let's look at, for example, let's look at this part right here with Paul. Look what it says a little later with Paul. There's a writing in a book of Acts 21, 37, and 8. And it says this. Watch what this Roman says to Paul. And as Paul, and if you know, let me show you what Paul looks like. And you probably know, I got a picture of Paul. In fact, let me pull it out. We got a picture of Paul. So this actually is great because we can show them together. Let's show what this writing was saying and what Paul looked like to the early saints. Do you know that we have a 1st, 2nd century portrait of Peter and Paul? And do you know what they actually look like? Based on some of the historical documents, right? It lets you know that Peter and Paul, especially the Jews at that time, had blackish hair, right? They had black hair at that time. And from the pictures, they have a very bushy beard. And from what it looks like, as we see that Egypt has started becoming more and more Afro-centric, this is Paul right here. What you're seeing right here in this painting, we're actually going to be looking at an actual image of a bronze disc, right? A bronze disc with 2nd century portraits of St. Peter and Paul. So this is going to be what the first apostolic fathers saw. So you know apostolic. So those are going to be their first fathers. How do you say fathers, right? Well, I'm saying fathers because they're the ones that would be like the heads of the church. Let me actually type it down so that we can see that. The reason why I'm typing this down, because I want you to know about how pinpoint this information gets. Because when you start looking at the pinpoint information and start comparing individuals, you'll start finding some very interesting groups. I'm gonna use a secondary source. So right here, apostolic. So apostolic, actually, when you compare that with apostolic Christians, that's your 1st century Christians, your earliest Christians. You ain't studying Christian history unless you're looking at the apostolic church, unless you're looking at the apostolic beginnings. You got to look at the apostolic stuff, so apostolic age. So you don't know nothing about Christianity unless you had studied on these right here. And I'm talking external sources, right? Right, Clement. Well, we got better sources than Clement. Like Irenaeus, right? A lot of different individuals that I'm not gonna name right now because we gotta get into the understanding of Paul, but it does have like different writings of the earlier individuals. But I wanted to show you this because this is actually going to give you some of the earlier individuals that would be in the earlier time, right? You could put apostolic fathers or apostolic church, and that will get into those earlier things. The reason why is because not a lot of people know that the earlier ones were Jews. And we see Paul right here. Look at his beard. Let's make sure we get a good detailed understanding of how Paul looks. Look at his nose right here. Look at how thick his nose is. Look at the details that they put into. Whoever made this was so well skilled that they somehow made the design on this little coin. But there his hair is. You can see the detail on his hair, his curly hair, even his hair. And you can see his beard. There's his lips right there. His beard puffs out. That definitely shows that it has some definition to it. And there's his face right there. So we can get a good idea of how he looks. I would say he looks pretty negroid. I would say these Jews look negroid to me, especially Peter. Peter looks very negroid to me. See his lips right there, right? And there's his nose, and there's his strong brow right there. And his nose is very thick. Their noses are very thick right there. So I would say he looks negroid. Wouldn't you say he looks like these Egyptians that we were talking about earlier? Did you say that he would look like some of those Egyptians that we were just talking about earlier? I'll probably switch the picture. We need to go back to that because we need to look at those Egyptians. That's right here, right here. So doesn't he look kind of like these Egyptians, right? Let me just zoom in a little bit so we can get a good idea of how these Egyptians look before we read this. All right, zoom in. You can see how these Egyptians look. Let me zoom in as much as I could. Right. All right. So you can see their nose, see their noses and everything. All right. You can see his noses and everything. Black beard. Why did I say black beard? Because on this actual paper, it actually said that they had black beards. That's was something I had went over when I was reading this, when I was going over this from the actual page. They was talking about that they had black hair and whatnot. But notice what it says, right? So we see those Egyptians and everything. But notice what it says to Paul. So notice what was said to Paul, right? So we got a good idea what he looked like. And as Paul was to be led into the castle, so Paul was being led into the castle. So let's make sure we get a good idea of what Paul looks like. So when he's getting led into the castle, we get an idea of what the early Christians had seen. So Paul is being led into the castle. So and then one of the Roman chiefs had turned back and said, he said, "May I speak unto thee? May I speak to you?" He says, so this Roman said this, "Canst thou speak Greek, or can you speak Greek?" So he's looking at Paul, right? He's looking at Paul. He's looking at him, and he's saying, "Do he speak Greek? Does he look like a Greek on here? Does Paul look like a Greek?" And you probably have to ask him, "Does he speak Greek?" Right? He wouldn't speak English at that time. Either got to speak Greek or one of the other languages that's happening there. So he asked him, "Does he speak Greek?" He didn't even know if he can speak the language of the Gentiles. So the Roman continues. He says, "Art thou that Egyptian?" So he just called Paul an Egyptian. Said, "Aren't you an Egyptian?" Right? That was basically causing an uproar and everything. So he said Paul looked like an Egyptian, right? And it is an Egyptian, like we went over, groups that would be like, you would think look like Hamites. Look what it said with Moses, right? Did not Moses pass for Pharaoh's daughter, right? Daughter's son when he was when he was free, right? We know what he said, right? When he was free, he said this. This is what he said, Exodus 2:19. They said, this is what happens when he freed some people from basically some troubles and they went away. And this is what they said about Moses. They said, "An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds." They said, "An Egyptian delivered us out of the hands of the shepherd." During the time, said Ramsey II, right? Said, "An Egyptian delivered us out of the hands of a shepherd." Right? Why do you think he had to put his hand in his cloak, took it out, it was leprous, put it back in, came back to his normal skin? Right? You know about the whole the whole shebang of that. If you know about that one, when he put his hand in his shirt, came out leprous as snow, white as snow. All of a sudden, he put it back in his shirt and he became his said, quote unquote, other flesh. So whatever the other flesh was, it wasn't white. It was another flesh. That means what's the other flesh? It was dark skin. He had a darker skin tone. That's just an honesty to know about these things. That's just an honesty to know about these things, right? So now we know. Now we got a good idea on some of those symbolisms or symbolic things there and how these things are connected. We can get a good understanding on why supposedly in the Middle Age they were saying Jews look like dark skins. Remember we was talking about Lachish, Let's talk a little bit about what this historian says about Lachish. He talks about Lachish. He says the 70 BC Assyrian campaign is my favorite example, he says. Why is it their favorite example? Just goes on and just lets you know about some things. When the historical sources and the archaeological record matches, more than 1,000 arrowheads found in the destruction of Lachish, for example, right? So we know that Lachish had no doubt major destruction layers and everything, but we also know that it has ties to what's later seen in the 1700s and in other time frames as, what's the word I'm looking for? The racist prejudice that continued on for a while. But a lot of people may not think that something that was going on, that apparently they were tying Jews with blacks and that Jews were black, right? Now, a lot of people would actually think that. But that was something that was actually, what's the word I'm looking for, happening for a long time. And that's what this was talking about, right? So very, 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 very important to kind of take a note of that. So let me make sure I point out one more thing on this. Got one more thing on this that I wanted to point out on here. Let me make sure I find that. Here's the original book right here. So this one is kind of interesting, what he says right here. Let me just point it out because I just read this, but I want to make sure that this is very highlighted, that when we point out the Jews, we're making a clear distinction that before the European Enlightenment, like if you don't know about the European Enlightenment, that's a time when they came together and they decided what's right, what's wrong, and all these different things. We're not claiming that they know all these things, but we know without a doubt that some of the individuals of the Enlightenment, even some of the like Jewish groups of the community, they say indeed the Jews were black, right? So that's something that we had spoke on, right? Just want to visually show that from what this historian is saying. Remember, right? 2021, this was from a historian that's saying that, right? Not me. I'm not writing this. I'm not saying that, but I'm agreeing with it because of the evidence. So that's something that we actually see that's true, right? Something that we see that's true. All right, so let me show one more thing now. Let's wrap it up with one more tool. Now I'm going to show these two pieces, right? Not a lot of people actually think about this when they think about where could these E groups be, right? When we think about like E1 and whatnot and E2 and all these things, where could they be at? They're actually in some places that not a lot of people will actually expect, right? They're actually also right here, right? They're also in the areas of Arabia. We had talked about this. If you ever study on the Marsh Arabs actually have evidence of E1B1A, as you can see right here. So these are actually E1B1A lineages. M191. You can see in these little areas. So all the way to even up here, whatnot. So these are gonna be your M2 lines. So they're all in these areas. You can see all in these areas here, all over here, right? All in Arabia and everything. Got some movements down into Africa and whatnot. There's no doubt that they're inside of Africa, but you gotta know how they got there, how they get into Africa versus their oldest finds. They got some movements, obviously in Portugal, obviously, and some areas of the British Isles. So you can see some into these different areas. There's no doubt that this one is going to be one that's settled around. And this is just from people that was willing to take the test. So people that was willing to take the test, they put this line on the map. So you can see it has a lot of different areas that's involved in. It's a lot of them in this little area here. So you can see in the area of Arabia, but it tells you the SNP and the break. That's E1B1A, M191. We'll close that. And that's the one that I had assumed was most likely those Israelite lineages. That's the one that I was assuming that is most likely the Israelite lineages. There's also another tool that I realized I didn't add to this, that is the heat tracker. And the heat tracker is nice because that one kind of tells a little bit of his movements. But I'll leave that like that, because that right there, what we're seeing when we're putting all these pieces together. I'm just gonna close that, and a lot of these that we don't really need right now. So what we're seeing when we're putting a lot of these pieces together, any one of these lines can be Israelite, but the highest portion that I believe that dates to the ancient original Israelites, it shows that they have original affinity with said African groups. And they'll call them African, and we can call them African because technically genetics also call them African. So if we know that the Israelites had a African factor to them, and yet we do find out that even though it's called African, a lot of its lines actually has ties to Eurasia. So a lot of these lines actually has early ties to Eurasia versus just being lines that are just only tied to Africa. That's going to be very important to also take in note about these lines, where actually they might be from. What's their real ties? It's not that this line is restricted to Africa and all of a sudden it flowed up only in the Middle Ages, but this line was all over Mesopotamia throughout the whole time of the Levant, throughout different time frames and everything. And we can see that it has a lot of different areas in the Levant today. Also is Afro-Asiatic. The linguistics match, the comparisons of groups match, and all of it is coming together in a harmonious form so that we can get a good understanding of these things. Now, with that said, I guess I have nothing else to say but this. When it comes to the groups that are said Israelites, we got to look a little closer and always realize that the Israelites are naturally a mixed company. Their original father would be Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I believe that their line of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob from the father's line would most likely be E1, B1 star. And when I say E1, B1 star, it could be most likely E1, B1A of any of the sorts. Some say it could be E1, B1B. I'm more leaning toward E1, B1A. That is just because of the different evidences and how diverse that line is in comparison. E1, B1C, I believe to be Esau. And a lot of these pieces actually go together very well into a harmonious understanding of these things. So I think that when we take the picture and put it all together in its full entirety, and we note that indeed E1, B1A are found in the ancient Israelites, then it all makes perfect sense when taking the genetic information at its source. So we do see that that line would have been there in Egypt and in different, what's the word I'm looking for? Jews, different Jews. So very, very, very interesting, I think. Very, very interesting. Yep. Amen. Amen. All right. So any questions or any statements or anything before we go, let me know. That will be our last video of this little for this series, the biblical academic origins. That doesn't mean that we won't come back and touch on genetics, but this would be a summary and a finale for what we had touched on. So this will tie in basically all this information and will be our last piece for today. So I'll summarize what we did today real fast while I address it. So we had talked about some of the Nubian and different groups that were in connection, like the Amorites, that were also in ties.
Ashkenazim and Sephardim and Yemenite Jews. And so there's even a genetic link there. And of course, everybody knows of the Ethiopian Jews, the Beta Israel, who.
Okay, so we already know that indeed when we went over history, the Amorites, the Nubians, they all have connections to Avaris, right? Genetic connections. Those groups come out. They settle in some of the areas that the Israelites settle at. especially at Lachish that was besieged by the Assyrians. What makes it important is that the Assyrians did something special at Lachish that allowed us to find the Israelites. They stacked their heads like a mountain, pretty much. Like when I say a mountain, they stacked them like a pyramid, pretty much. And that's why they found their skulls. There were like thousands of Israelite skulls that were there and whatnot. But that's what they have found when they have found some of the information, is that there was some deep ties to certain groups in those areas. I gotta make sure I open the Syrian note to make sure I add that to the sources afterwards. Add that to the sources afterwards. Make sure I add that. All right. So that's why we have found out that later in the Enlightenment and after the Middle Age, that's when they started to change on who were the Israelites. That's when they started to change who were the Israelites and everything. It was during the Enlightenment. For example, this little article right here, behind the Jew or Negro lay a century of transatlantic speculation on the racial status of the Jew. In the American South, the problem of the Jewish racial identity was a footnote to the large debate on Black-white relations, a question pushed forward in the racial unsettlement period. So racial unsettlement period, that's the Enlightenment and all that. The 1850s to 1915s, Jews were accepted as white. So they say during that Enlightened time frame, they said, oh, we'll accept them as white. So they're like, yeah, they're white. So all of a sudden it changed. And so they were accepted as white. But their precise racial place was not fixed. Because look, what was their long tradition that we just talked about that this individual was talking about? When he was talking about there was a long ancient transition that had happened that actually talked about what the people looked like a long time ago. And we know if we look at ancient sources and everything, right, we can find out some very interesting stuff that others were talking about, right? That's why he was talking about right here, right, from the Middle Ages to the 18th century to the Nazi time frame, right, that he says identify the Jews were multicolored, right? They were multicolored. And it says basically if you looked hard enough, all Jews were actually black, right? That's why he's talking about is a real thing in the Middle Ages right here. A long tradition of European folklore, right, reinforced by an emergence of racial science, cast the Jews on the black side of the color line. Cast the Jews on the black side of the color line, right? We can see what's going on there. So that's a totally different quote from a different place, right? So this is Directions of Southern Jewish History, right? John Hickson University, whatnot. So American Jewish History. It's just said that supposedly the Jews in ancient times were described as black. That's something that is important to kind of note on these things, right? So it's not something that is new. It's not something that's new, but it's something that some people may not have seen or may not heard, may not be ready for yet, but it's absolutely true. All these things that I'm showing you is going to be absolutely true and reflectable, right? Reflectable to go back on and get a verification on what's happening with a lot of these things. This one, I thought there was one more I wanted to point out on this right here. I think I already pointed out that one. All right. So again, summary. So we had looked at like how it says Moses and Paul, how they look like Negroes, how they said they look like Egyptians and everything. So aren't you that Egyptian? Even the Romans couldn't recognize them. They didn't look like Romans. The two didn't look the same. So some of the Greeks didn't look the same. We point out how in the Yemenis and the Ethiopian Jews, we had high portions of L2 and L3, which are high and said African groups. And we know that that's going to be very important, as it says, of the African L haplogroups. It says a high frequency of sub-Saharan African L haplogroups was found in both Jewish populations, right? So you can see what's going on there in that group, right? So that's very important. We also know that even though that L3 and those L groups are in Africa, they had ties to Eurasia. That's something to know. It also has lineages in Asia today. It has lineages in Arabia, Saudi Arabia, just like how even M2 has lineages in Saudi Arabia, right? A lot of lineages in Saudi Arabia and Arabia and everything. And in the L3 lines, you can see without a doubt that this line would have ties with Egypt, right? Other places, without a doubt, like Yemen, the Arab Emerald. You got all types of different areas. Obviously, India. Remember, we talked about the Jews of India, Libya, Lebanon, right? So that's Israel, right? Pakistan, obviously Egypt, that we just said, right? So they're all in the Fertile Crescent. So these lines rule all in the Fertile Crescent, so they can easily be Israelites, right? We know that L groups were in a lot of ancient cultures in ancient times. That's something that we do know, right? We know that the E groups have a lot of locations also in the Fertile Crescent in Arabia, right? So these are things that we know without a doubt, right? So I'll put this on the playlist and I'll put some things in the description. We also know that some E groups were seen all the way in the time of, how you say, what's the word I'm looking for? After Assyria, right? Even before Assyria, they will be settled in areas of Levant, right? So that's something that we know without a doubt, right? This was something that I think brings together a lot of ties and everything, right? And then we had talked about some historical talks that talked about how the Nazis were convinced that the Jews were negroid, right? And then we talked about how those negroid Jews were banished to San Tome, right? Those Black Portuguese were expelled to San Tome, St. Thomas, right? They were Negroes that were sent down into the areas. And then we looked at their genetics and we found that they were E1B1 groups with, right? E1B1A, E1B1B, R groups with some small mtDNA groups of Europeans and mostly of those said African groups that they say have ties to Nubians and whatnot, right? And then we have point out how E1B1A does have ties to ancient Israelites, right? Even though they want to throw in some misleader, this is called misleading. That's what that's called. If they want to say E1B1A is 40,000 years ago in the Horn of Africa, let us see a fossil of it and let us see that find in that culture. There is none. So that's very important. But they did verify that it had ties with a real culture called the Natufian in the Levant. And they also admitted that it had ties to ancient Israelites. So that is very important to know. That also other document papers actually show that. They would have had obviously ties to the time of the Exodus, right? They would have had times during the time of the New Kingdom and everything. See lower Nubia and everything and whatnot, having connections to those areas and whatnot. They would have had connection to the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom. So the Exodus, they could have definitely had part with the Exodus and everything. That's definitely not a problem for them. So we had looked at how the Nubians look. Remember, the Israelites had a Nubian affinity, an Egypto-Nubian affinity and everything. So with that, that's all I got for now, family. May you be blessed. May you be beloved. And amen, family.